most people on this call, but I don't know everyone. So to those who are new to me, I want to offer you a hello. And for those who are hanging out with our magnificent Sherry Torah community for the first time, I want to say Bruchim Habaim. We're so glad that you are here and you're with us to study Torah on this night. And here's what's going to happen this evening. I'm going to share a little bit of my Torah, a little bit of teaching, and then for roughly an hour, and then we're going to pause and we're going to light the candles. And I've asked Sarah and Rob Sturts to light the candles for us from just around 8:10ish, 8:15ish, which is when candle lighting is. And then Chaim is going to, Chaim, by the way, is Amira's daddy.
Better known as.
Amira is the smallest person who's here tonight.
Aww.
And then at about 9:15, Professor Natan Meir, who's the head of Jewish Studies at PJA, at what's it called, PSU, will be teaching at that time. And then I will also provide you with the link to ongoing learning that the Rabbinical Assembly, which is the conservative movement's rabbinic arm, they've put together a fantastic night of learning. And I'll provide you the link with that so that you can continue. I'll just say very briefly that there is a well, actually, sorry. Let me say before I forget. If you are when we light the candles, you want to light also a very long burning candle, like a 48-hour candle. The reason for that is because the festival is 2 days long, and so you light candles tomorrow night as well. And we're supposed to light from a pre-existing flame. So you're going to light the long burning candle, and you will also light the 2 candles for the festival tonight. And then tomorrow night you would light the candles for tomorrow night from that long burning candle. And and also, I want to say, if you also want to get a Yizkor candle, which you would light tomorrow night, for those who are saying Yizkor in memory of somebody. So you don't light that tonight, but you want to have that at the ready.
Where does one get a long burning 48-hour candle?
Well, honestly, at this point,
Molly, next year we're gonna get it next year. Okay.
There you go. Yeah. So actually, it doesn't have to be 48-hour burning. It just needs to light through. It really needs to be a 25-hour burning candle, so you can light from it tomorrow night. But in general, you can get those at the store, at the Fred Meyer may have them, a Judaica store may have them, but in any event, so that was one thing that I wanted to say. And then the other thing is just for those who are give me 1 second, let me tend to this. For those who are new to this, I want to say that that there's a tradition the tradition is to study through the whole night, like literally nonstop until the morning, and it's called a Tikkun Leil Shavuot. And the reason for this is that we receive Torah on this night, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And so that we acknowledge that the giving of Torah did not just happen one time, but happens continuously. And so we want to remain alert and awake for it. And therefore we stay up to show our readiness and our preparedness, and we stay up throughout the whole night. I have to be honest with you and tell you it's been a couple of years since I've done that. But it's a worthy thing to do, and that's why I'll provide you with the link to study through the night with the Rabbinical Assembly, teachers from across the country. So we're not studying through the whole night, but we'll be studying for a few hours, and then, as I said, I'll provide you that link. It sounds like I may have confused Natan and Chaim about the times that you all are supposed to teach. So if the two of you would like to chat it out between the two of you, Chaim Schramm and Natan Meir, maybe you can correct the mistake that I may have made. So I apologize for confusion. But you know what? It wouldn't be Shavuot with Rabbi Rose if there weren't some errors in the planning. So I just wanted to make sure that I didn't surprise anybody with my last Chag teaching as the rabbi here by having things going too smoothly. So that's, Natan, why I erred. And the last thing I'll say by way of introduction is that though God willing, I know this is not the last chance that I will have to spend time in this magnificent community, and God willing, not the last chance that I will have a chance to teach in this synagogue community. And I know that I assure you that I will be teaching in Portland after I'm done being the congregational rabbi here. Nonetheless, I want to just acknowledge that this is a very special night for me because it's the last Chag where I'll be teaching as the rabbi, my last Shavuot, and I just want to say that I want to thank all of those who've studied Torah with me and who've taught me Torah through those discussions. This is I don't have to tell you all what a very special community this is. If you are not yet attached to this community, but you're dipping your toe in the water, I want to tell you this is the place to be. This is a magnificent Jewish community in Portland, and it's growing and it's developing, and the new rabbi that we have coming in, Rabbi Gary Oren, who's coming in the summer, is really, really just he's supposed to be a beautiful, beautiful teacher. I can tell you he's a beautiful neshama. This community is very, very excited about where we're going next. And but I just want to express my gratitude to everybody for this beautiful journey, and especially to those who learn with me frequently. You know who you are. With that, I really want to just to jump in here, okay? So I'm I'm going to start in a little bit of a strange way, and I want to be careful with doing this because the topic that I've chosen to teach about is the Torah in the eyes of George Floyd, and to talk about the irreducible dignity of the other, irreducible dignity of human beings. And the reason I want to be careful is because I'm aware of the possibility of it appearing like I'm using George Floyd as a prop for the teaching of Torah, and I accept that there's a risk that I could be misunderstood in doing that, because God forbid that that would be entirely contrary to my entire message tonight, to use another human being who died tragically as a kind of stage on which I'm going to stand up and teach Torah. And so I'm about to show you some photographs of George Floyd. And the reason I'm doing that is because this is precisely what this shiur is about being able to recognize the humanity of the other. I don't usually teach in this way, but as I was researching in the class and spending all these time in the texts, I realized that I wanted to measure the texts and their power against what was the source and the inspiration for this teaching. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But if you just bear with me for a moment, I want to just share some of these pictures so we can have this in mind as we learn this evening. So. So not much to say, except this is George Floyd and his daughter. Can folks see? I can't hear anybody. Yes, give me a thumbs up if you're looking at a picture right now. Yes, okay, yes. Thank you. Great. And what we see is, and this is the memorial that was at the location where he was killed. He was killed right, my understanding is right around here to the left of this awning. So apparently he was part of a church. This is part of his church group, his ministry group. This is him in the black hat holding up the what I think is a copy of the Bible. So I wanted to share those pictures with you because I guess I wanted to ground us in a memory of, even though it's Chag, in a memory of the horror that we felt when we saw the picture of the officer kneeling on his neck. And the reason for that is I actually want to focus on that moment from the experience, not of Mr. Floyd, but the experience of those who are around, who witnessed it, and the experience of all of us as we saw with horror what had happened. And the reason for that, the reason I want to emphasize this deeply disturbing moment, is because I think that something terribly important happened at that moment, which is that, and here's where I really want to be careful. And I'm even uncomfortable as I say this. At that moment, something erupted into the world. Something erupted into our hearts. Our ordinary consciousness was undone as a certain kind of energy was revealed, a certain reality was revealed. And I'm using the word revealed in Revelation quite deliberately. And that's kind of the framework on which I want to build the discussion, or the teaching that I want to offer you. There was a revelation in that moment. And the revelation, let me turn off my phone here because it's not stopping. The revelation that I have in mind was multifaceted, and I think it's a revelation of many meanings. One revelation was the cruelty and the violence that exists in our society. And what I want to take pains to point out, although it's not really the focus of my comments tonight, is that the police officer, Derek Chauvin, is not a monster. Now, I say this not by way of defense of his actions, obviously, but it's deeply important for us to see that what was done at the hands of a human being who has the same impulses and capacities that everyone on this call has. And I've come to believe, as I've thought and read about this, that it's profoundly important that we come out of our reflections about these moments of crisis in our country and in our lives not pretending that the world is divided into devils and angels, because I actually think that is far, far more dangerous. Because I think that when we move through the world and we create a moral system that assumes that it's merely other people who are a terrible danger, we actually put ourselves and we put our communities at terrible risk, because we become blind to the fact that we have the capacity for evil within us. So that's one comment. But again, I'm not going to be focusing on that side of things. I think that the other revelation that happened at that moment was that in a way that we didn't even have to think about, in a way that didn't demand or require or even allow for rationalizations or explanations, we saw the magnificent dignity of another human being being violated. And we understood that instantly. We did not need a moral framework. We didn't need, for instance, Black Lives Matters. I'm not making a value judgment. I hope it's clear about Black Lives Matters. My point is, we didn't need an analysis. We didn't need to wait until after the video had completed and then have people tell us that what we had just seen was horrific. Every person who saw that shuddered, because they saw a human being who was worthy of respect being treated like a thing. And that was a critical revelation for us. So I want to use that as the background to talk about some ideas from Jewish texts now that I want to turn to, with my having shared with you why I wanted to teach on this topic. Again, because I think it's an essential lesson for us to reflect upon as Americans and as Jews. Now, let me say one more word of introduction, and that is, given what I just said, that every human being saw instantly, without any analysis, that we witnessed a horror and we saw the violation of human dignity, then why do we need Jewish texts? Why? Because I'm now about to introduce you to many Jewish texts that I hope will help us to deepen our relationship to this event and to give us a framework for thinking about it. But why is that necessary? And what I want to be very clear about is that we do not need the Torah to teach us that that what happened to George Floyd was unspeakable and horrible. Very few of the people protesting against it, if you count the numbers, very few of them were Jewish. Perhaps an outsized percentage, by percentage of the group, perhaps Jews are overrepresented, but I don't even want to make that claim because I don't know. My point is that everybody, whether they have a religious tradition or not, knows immediately that that can't be repeated, and their society has to find ways to eradicate that kind of horror from being propagated upon anybody. But therefore, why do we need Jewish texts? Well, I think the answer to that is that revelation, and the fact that we can have a revelation that comes from experience, from our world, and not from the Torah, is so important to us. It's so important that we remember that our values, that a part of our values comes from the Torah, and that part of our understanding of the Torah and of ourselves comes from our experience in this world and our relationship to other people. Does that make sense? And that therefore, it's important for us to reflect on our experience of the world, and it's important for us to feel in our hearts, to feel our experience in the social world and in the political world, because those are an essential part of the Torah that we have to learn and that we have to bring into the world. And so Jewish texts here are not are not that which gives us the platform on which to say what happened to George Floyd was wrong, but rather George Floyd and the experience that we all had of witnessing that horror deepen our relationship to Torah and give us a way to understand what it means to be part of a religious community and to be in relationship with God. Okay, so that's my that's kind of the background against which I want you to understand these texts. Let's see here. Now, going against my better judgment, I want to give people the opportunity to ask questions, and I'm just going to take 3, which is ridiculous because we have a lot of people here. But if you want to raise your hand, I'm just going to call on 3 folks if anybody wants to ask me to clarify something or wants to add something to what I said. Scanning my screen, going once. Oh, I almost just called it myself. Going twice. Okay. All right, so let's continue. I'm going to go now to the texts that I have. Give me just a moment to get this right. Just want to find the sheet that I got ready. Okay. Okay, so some of this, so I have a lot of texts, but some of them I'm really just putting them up here because I'm going to mention them and we're not going to spend time on them. But one thing that's essential is this first text from the book of Bereshit, from the book of Genesis. Vayomer Elokim na'aseh adam b'tzalmenu kidmutenu. God said, we're going to make human beings in our image, after our likeness. And God created human beings in God's image. In the image of God, God created them, male and female. Okay? So we start with the idea that in some way, each of us bears the stamp of the divine. And I want to suggest that it may be that idea that is encapsulated in our visceral disgust at seeing another human being abused, that we have some sense that something has been violated that can't be rationalized or excused, but that something eternal has been wounded and broken. And we're going to come back to this idea and spend quite a bit of time on it in my concluding remarks. But I just wanted to get that out there, that that's a foundation in many ways of every Jewish ethic, of every Jewish moral system, of every system of reflection about the relationship between human beings and what's at stake morally, is this idea that another person is not just a person, that somehow that other person contains the divine, that other person is infinite in his or her value, and that we sense that when we witness somebody's dignity being violated. Okay, so I just wanted to remind you of that core text in our tradition, and we're going to continue. Is there a Hebrew reader who would be willing to read this passage from Pirkei Avot? I see Miles. I see Natan. Anybody want to read this?
If you could make it larger, people can read it better. I'm not the only one with old lady.
Okay, yeah, you bet. I've got a ginormous screen here, so there we go. Miles, you want to read that? You're muted. There you go.
Oh, sorry. We had already made it bigger, so just a second. I have to make it smaller now.
It says, okay, Mishnah Avot, and we're in Gimel Yud Daled. Hu haya omer chaviv adam shenivra b'tzelem. Hiba yetera nodaat lo shenivra b'tzelem shene'amar in Bereshit 9. Ki b'tzelem Elokim asa et ha'adam.
Okay, so Pirkei Avot, which is part of the Mishnah, and the Mishnah is like the first layer of rabbinic discourse after the Torah was canonized, and the rabbis begin to reflect on its meaning and to extrapolate its implications. Is the Mishnah, and Pirkei Avot is part of that Mishnah. So very early. And I cut off who this is attributed to, but the teaching is beloved is man or human beings, since they are created in the image. A deeper love, that it is revealed to him, that is to human beings, that he has created in the image. Okay? So God not only made us in the divine image, whatever that might mean. We know it doesn't mean something physical. It means there's some element in us that touches the divine. But and that fact attests to how beloved we are to the Creator. The fact that God chose to make us with some image of the divine in us. But not only that, it's an additional measure of love that God allowed us to know that we're created in the divine image, right? That we not only are created in the divine image, but that we have an awareness of that. And that we have an awareness not only of God's affection for humanity, but in our awareness that we're related to the divine, there's a sign of an additional love. And this is a magnificent text. We could spend the whole night on it. It's not one of my main texts, so I'm going to kind of race by it. But what I want us to think about is what is it? Why is it that the Mishnah teaches us that our awareness of being created in the divine image is a sign of divine love? What is what's in it for us, in other words? How does that prove that God loves us, but that God made us aware? And as a footnote, I'll just say we could either say that awareness comes from some intuitive sense, or just the fact that it's been revealed to us through the Torah. What is it about our awareness that is a signal of God's love for us? Okay. And what I want to suggest is that imposes upon us both an inherent sense of our own value, but also it gives us a sense of our responsibility to others. And that a life invested with responsibility is a life that is more magnificent and beautiful, and therefore evidence of God's love. But there's a difficulty now and a problematic in that if I'm created in the divine image, and I know that you're created in the divine image, I now have responsibility in relationship to you, which means that I am limited in relationship to you, right? If I lived alone on a desert island, I could do whatever I wanted. And I'm not, by omission or commission, I'm not going to damage you at all, damage any other, because there's no other around. But that's an empty kind of life. My life is enriched in relationship to the other, but now I have to worry about, now you've imposed yourself upon me because I have to think about what your existence means for me. Okay? Now again, fold this into it may sound like we're beginning to get philosophical, but fold this into those images of George Floyd, and you see immediately that our reaction to it, the first layer of reaction is simply emotional, and revulsion or anguish. But immediately we all went to, what can I do? What must I do? And probably everybody on this call reacted to that moment in different ways in the days and the weeks and the months that followed, trying to solve that, or to answer that question, what must I do? We knew that we couldn't save George Floyd's life, but we had a sense that something in us had changed. Something had erupted into the moral universe that we were now aware of, imposed itself on our consciousness, that spoke of some kind of responsibility, right? And in the language of the Mishnah, that's because we, being created in the divine image, know that we have some special responsibility for the other, and that George Floyd, who was created in the divine image, that his life was not treated as such, and that therefore some wrong had been done. Okay, so let's keep that in our minds. Okay. Now, if I want to add, before we turn to this next text, I want to ask you a question. This is a strange one and maybe hard to answer, but it's important. As you recall the weeks and the months, and even now the present, in your reaction, once you got past the revulsion and the anger and the disgust and the pain and the anguish and the sympathy for the family, and you began to answer that question, what can I do? What kind of reactions did you have? Either emotionally, in other words, I felt confused, I felt determined, or just in terms of, like literally, I decided that I would give money to this, or I'd volunteer, or I would go to marches. Can we just talk about how did you respond to that next level? Who's willing to share what was going on for you? Craig.
So immediately we wanted to go out and join the protests at the very beginning, but of course it was the middle of a pandemic, and we didn't want to be in the middle of a crowd of thousands and thousands of people, many without masks, so that was out of the question. Our friend, I found out pretty quickly that our friend Jenny Spector, Marshall's daughter and Sharon's daughter, was leading a little group of her friends and included some of us parents to start studying and learning and watching films like I think it was called The 13th, about the 13th Amendment. And we did it for about a month and a half. Once a week, we'd get together for a couple hours on a Zoom call. And it was really great, for a few of the parents, Jan and me and a few of the guys, folks of our generation, to hear from these young, passionate people and their perspectives on things. It was really great. And we learned a lot. And then the Federation started its series, I think probably in the fall. They started a series of Zoom talks with people from the African American community and the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, and all these different communities to kind of talk about their history and their experiences in Oregon and more broadly. So it was a matter of a lot of learning. And
your response was, I want to learn.
Yeah.
Okay. Beautiful. I forgot that Jenny did that. That's amazing. I see Sarah's hand, and then I'll call on one other person after Sarah.
Not to be critical of the way you put it, Rabbi, but I did not get past the revulsion, and the emotion, and the I don't even want to say the bitterness. I could understand some things better.
Yeah, well said.
Feel better because I saw it. I mean, there's always been a response in me like that, but this just took it to a whole other level.
Right. Well said.
I think that from early on, what I felt a need to do, besides the donations and endless talking on TV, was a desire to be aware, more aware, increasingly aware, as I heard documentary or commentary or firsthand accounts.
Right.
And I felt a responsibility to be a witness to history.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then finally, I agree with what Craig says. It's a pandemic. Who's going where,
Right.
High risk people, we're not going out. And yet we did. We went on a small walk, march, gathering with our grandchildren's elementary school.
Yeah.
And we carried signs.
Right.
And we chanted and we remembered names. And I did that as much for my grandchildren to see that we cared.
Right.
We cared the same that they cared, that we wanted to show them the example of one thing you can do when you see something so shocking.
Yeah. Well, so thank you both for sharing that. And having said I was going to call on a third person, I'm watching the time. I'm realizing I'm going to push this forward. So I'll try to make time at the end for additional comments. But I don't know. I really appreciate both of you sharing what you shared, and I completely identify with the impulse to learn. Like, what is it that I'm not seeing? I also had a very strong sense of, I don't know what to do. Right now, clearly there was a lot of, white Americans of all stripes and backgrounds were being given tools and encouragement to learn. I remember reaching out to a friend African American friend who works in these circles, saying, and my intent was to ask him, what can I do? And before I got in touch with this person, he had posted on Facebook, please stop asking what to do and educate yourselves, which I thought was very interesting. I understood it, but don't put the burden on me to tell you what to do. And if I don't get back to you, you're off the hook. So there was this sense of like, how do I help? I did go downtown, I did protest, but I also knew that of course that wasn't in and of itself going to do anything. And here's the part where I'm just really like putting it out there in an honest way. And I guess assuming and knowing that I'm not the only person who had this experience, I'm just going to say nakedly that the months, as I look back on this year in my life, I think of a couple of different things. And please please don't think that I'm speaking flippantly. I'm trying to say this by way of self-critique, self-exposure. So be gentle here. But I think of two things. One is I think of the murder of George Floyd and the way everything we've talked about, the way that penetrated the consciousness of our country and changed us all. And then I also think of the way that COVID inconvenienced me, and the fact that, for example, over the last year, I spent a lot of time learning guitar. Like my guitar skills really elevated. And I had the sense, and I still have the sense, like, really? That's what you did after George Floyd died? Now, I did more than that, obviously. Like all of you, I tried to find how I could be a good citizen, but I just am aware that there was this question of, is there really so much I can do? I want to hold that ambivalence out there, trusting that I'm not the only person who had that experience, because I want to fold that into this next text. So I'm going to keep going. So Vayomer Hashem el Cain. So now we're in the book of Genesis, the story of Cain and Abel. Vayomer Hashem el Cain, hevel achicha. God knows that Cain has killed Abel and says, where is Hevel, your brother? Where is Abel, your brother? Vayomer lo yadati, Vayomer lo yadati, hashomer achi anochi. And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? And what I want to just, this text too, we could spend our lives just looking at that sentence, believe me. But what I want to point out is that there's something built into the sentence that is so powerful that I think captures what it is to be a human being in relationship to other human beings, which is that this, am I my brother's keeper? You can't really see it in the English, but in Hebrew, it is simultaneously a statement and a question. Or I should say, rather, you can read it as a statement and as a question. You can actually read this as Cain saying too much, saying almost something he didn't intend, saying, Hashomer achi anochi. My keeper, the keeper of my brother am I. Like, as though it's some acknowledgement, like under the interrogation of the power of God's question, it's almost as though Cain can do nothing but acknowledge, I am my brother's keeper. But at the same time, we can read it the way it is normally read, and which clearly works better in terms of the plain reading, which is as a question, as the interrogative, the letter Hey, signaling the question, Hashomer achi anochi? Am I my brother's keeper? And I want to suggest that verse is so immensely powerful because it captures this ambivalence that is built into the human experience, which is, on the one hand, I know by seeing your face, I know. And I'm going to come back to face specifically because we're going to talk a little bit about a philosopher who's going to talk about the importance of the vision of the face. I know when I see you that I have responsibility for you because you look just like me. You're a human being, no matter any human being. If you may have had the experience of seeing somebody you really disagree with, or even someone you don't like, and when you see that person being embarrassed in some way or hurt in some way, your heart does not ask your brain, should I care about this person? You immediately feel badly for that person. So there's something about simply confronting another that you know that you are responsible for him or her. And yet the ordinary experience of being a human who has his own problems or wants to play her guitar or has her own interests that she wants to cultivate, you also ask it as a question, am I really responsible? Isn't there someone else who's dealing with that? I'm not going to try to answer this. I'm going to say that these two facts, the question and the affirmation, exist in us simultaneously. And it's not a problem in the software. It's built into who you are. And it's supposed to be that way. And if it weren't a question, you're really asking, am I really? Then there would be no need for the Torah. So don't feel bad the fact that it's a question. Okay. I'm actually going let's just say this. So, will somebody read this in the English? I happen to be looking at you, Harvey Frankel. Will you read here the Exodus passage? So now we're in the book of Exodus. We've been introduced to Moses as this little boy who floats on the river, and he grows up in the household of Pharaoh, having been rescued by Pharaoh's daughter. And then after he grows up, we get to this verse. Harvey, we read in English?
He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. And it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown up. Does not everything grow up? Do not men
Sorry. I wasn't clear. Sorry. Read this bit. I was confused.
Sometime after that, when Moses had grown up, he went out to his kinsfolk and witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen.
Okay, so who knows what happens here? What does Moses do?
He kills the oppressor.
Right. He immediately reacts. Well, actually, that's not quite true. He looks this way and that way, and then he kills the Egyptian. Okay, and this begins the whole Moses story. Okay, so now I'm going to give you a minute to read this quietly, this next paragraph, and let me tell you what you're looking at. This next paragraph is from the Midrash, from Midrash Tanchuma, and I'm having you read it quietly just in the interest of time. Midrash Tanchuma explores this idea that Moses grew up, and it wants to just see what's in there. And it's going to explore the idea that that Moses looked at the burdens of the Israelites, the difficulties that his brethren are experiencing, and then it refers to the next verse, which I didn't include here, which is he looks this way and that way, and but that's what this midrash is reflecting on. So just this paragraph, I want you to read this quietly to yourself. So this text teaches us a couple of things. One thing that it teaches us is the extraordinary moral power of Moses. But I think that using this text as a way to lionize Moshe and say, see what a wonderful guy he was, sort of misses the point. The question is, what is it about this guy that God said, that's the person I'm going to use to lead my people. That's the person I'm going to share the secret to holiness with. That's the person I'm going to reveal the Torah to. And there's a whole bunch of these midrashic texts that lead up to the revelation that explore the personality of Moses and seek to give us an understanding for what was it about this character that God saw fit to reveal the Torah to him and to make him the leader of the Jewish people and to bring them out of Egypt. Because the Torah text itself doesn't tell us very much. And so our oral tradition helps us understand what it is that is required to merit that kind of connection to God and to merit the ability to bring redemption to the Jewish people. So what is it? What is it in Moses? So let me just turn that question over to you. What is it in Moses that makes him extraordinary according to this text? Harvey? You're muted.
Well, he wasn't aware of the situation, seeing as he grew up in Pharaoh's palace. So when he came out, he was outraged by the Israelite situation. He was so outraged that he lost control.
Right. Yeah, exactly. He grows up in a environment. Moses grows up in a gated community. He lives in Niles Hills or whatever, Nile Hills. And he's shut off, but he knows that these are his people. And he goes and he sees, and he is so outraged, as Harvey said, that he responds. But what I want to emphasize is the seeing, right? That he goes out and he looks. And in his looking, his looking does not distance him. He does not turn the Israelites into simply an object of his looking, right? Because there's a way in which looking can distance us from another, right? There's a way of gazing or gawking at the otherness of the person we're looking at. And in that gaze, we created a mental distance, like, oh my gosh, they live in a different world than I live. But there's a way of seeing or a way of looking that immediately dissolves the gap between ourselves and the other. And I want to suggest that the gaze that happened when we saw that horrific video or the horrific still picture of George Floyd was the latter kind for so many of us, right? Instantly, we understood that in some way that we can't really articulate, that was us, right? And I say that with respect to an awareness of the vast differences that separate the experience of an African-American male in the United States from our own experience. But we were able to access our common humanity, and therefore it was not difficult for us to be horrified at what we saw. Something about that moment allowed a kind of seeing that is holy and precious, even though it's painful. Because it's painful, it can penetrate our ordinary way of seeing. And I want to suggest that was something like what happened to Moses. When he saw them, their burden became his burden. And this person who was a prince of Egypt, who was at the very highest point in his society, is doing the labor of people who are at the very bottom of the society, because he does not accept that there's any distinction between him and them. His heart breaks when their heart breaks. And that capacity to see and to melt into the other, I want to suggest, according to this midrash, is the first sign to God and to us that there's something that this person can access, Moses can access in himself, that is going to be the seed of redemption. that ability to see the other and to eliminate the difference between self and other, is what makes Moses Moses. Okay? Let me keep going. I'm going to actually skip that. Okay. I want us to look now. There's a beautiful Mishnah that I'll have to work on forgiving myself that we're skipping because it's so beautiful and important, but we're going to have to keep going because I wanted to share these other texts with you. So, you know that when God gives the Torah to the Jewish people, God has that Torah placed within a whole elaborate architectural structure. God says, "Asuli mikdash v'shechanti b'tocham." Let them make for me a holy space that I shall dwell among them. And then there's elaborate discussion in the book of Exodus about the design and the construction of this space. Well, in the very holiest space of the entire holy area, at the center of everything, even more central than the altar itself, is the place where the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 Commandments, the Torah itself resides, the teachings about how to create a holy life and create a holy society. Those 10 Commandments, that Torah rests inside of an aron, of an ark, a holy ark. Above the ark are the cherubim, the keruvim. So this text now describes those keruvim. So let us see here. I just want to find another reader. Trevor Bryant, will you read this in English?
The cherubim shall have their wings spread over above, shielding the cover of with their wings. They shall confront each other, the faces of the cherubim being turned toward the cover. Okay, so it's a slightly awkward translation. That idea of that they're confronting each other. It really what it says is it says that their wings were spread like a cover over the cover of the ark, and their faces was each face was turned to the other, literally each to its accompaniment, each to its brother, is how the faces of the keruvim were supposed to be. And I want us just to think about that image for a moment. Think about that magnificent image, that above the holiest part of the entire holy spaces, at the very center, literally at the center of the Jewish people, as we read in last week's Torah portion, all the tribes are arrayed around the Mishkan, and at the center is the Mishkan, the holy space, and at the center of the holy space are the 10 Commandments. And above the 10 Commandments are these two keruvim facing one another, staring at one another. Now, the way the rabbis understand this is complex, but I want us to read a passage from the Gemara, from the Talmud, that explores this a little bit, and so I want to ask somebody to read this, and then we'll forge on. Megan Harned, can I get you to read this in English?
Sure thing. Which section?
Right here. How were the cherubs standing?
How were the cherubs standing? Rabbi Yohanan and Rabbi Elazar disagree about this. One says their faces were turned one toward the other, and one says their faces were turned toward the house.
So when the Gemara, this is from the Talmud, when the Talmud says the house, it's referring to the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, and it may refer here to the altar. Okay, keep going.
But according to the one who says that their faces were turned one toward the other, isn't it written, and their faces were toward the house?
So pause there. So the Talmud is citing a text that we don't have in front of us from Chronicles, where it says something different. It says that the faces of the keruvim were turned towards the bayit. They weren't looking at each other. So now the rabbis have a problem, because the Torah itself, the text that we just read from the book of Exodus, says that the cherubim, the angels' faces, will be staring at each other. But if we go past the Torah and look at the book of Chronicles, It doesn't say that they're looking at each other. It says that their faces they weren't looking at each other. They were looking away from one another. So now it's trying to figure out what the problem is, or what the solution is, rather. Keep going.
This is not a difficulty, i.e. a contradiction. Here, it was when the Jewish people do the will of God. There was when the Jewish people do not do the will of God.
In other words, what this text is saying is that when the Jewish people do the will of God, somehow the faces of the cherubim are staring at one another, right? So at the time when the Jewish people were fulfilling the will of God, the cherubs were gazing one at the other, just like I'm gazing at you right now. But later on in Jewish history, when the Jewish people were not fulfilling the will of God properly, the cherubim couldn't look at one another, and they looked away from one another. Okay, that's the Talmud's way to resolve these two different facts we have. That at one point they were facing each other, and at another point they weren't. So what I want to say about this astonishing text is that, and then I'll pause because there are very likely questions, and if you're confused, it's okay. You're probably in good company. What I want to say about this is that the rabbis, first of all, the rabbis understand that the two cheruvim looking at each other symbolize the Jewish people gazing into the eyes of God. Okay, so that's how the rabbis understand the symbolism of this. That one cherub represents the Jewish people, and another cherub represents God. And when they're looking at each other, therefore, it signifies that all is right in the world, right? We're looking right at God and vice versa. But there's no way to read this, I think. There's no way to read the image of the cherubs looking at each other without detecting also some lesson about how human beings relate to one another. In other words, when we look at one another, when we can see the face of the other, we're doing the will of God. When we are looking into the eyes of the other, that somehow we are fulfilling God's will. Or perhaps put differently, given that the cherubs are resting over the Ten Commandments, that is the Torah itself, we could read it perhaps as, if you fulfill the Torah, you will be looking at the other. Or we might look at it in the other direction. If you want to understand the Torah, you must have the capacity to look at the other in the face. That there somehow is something essential about the gaze of the other and our capacity to truly see and take account of the other person that is essential to a revelation of Torah. And again, I invite you to contemplate that story about Moses, and I invite you to contemplate what I'm suggesting was a moment of revelation when we all took in that horrible moment, that horrific moment in the murder of George Floyd, that somehow there was a revelation in our ability to see. And in some way, everything rests upon our ability to see in that moment. Okay. So let me pause there. I've got one other text I'm going to just conclude with. Let me just see if there are questions or comments about anything I've said. And if you have, I know that sometimes in these classes, especially when I move at a quick pace as I am now, somebody out there has a very basic elemental question that they're afraid to ask because it's too elemental and they don't want to sound dumb. And little do they know that 90% of the other people on the call have the same question. So if you have a question you feel is too elemental, you must ask it, because it's not. Questions, comments? Don't make me lean back on my Bueller joke from Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Just don't give me that much silence. Okay, I see Harvey's hand. Anybody else who has not had a chance? Okay, Harvey, go ahead.
Doesn't Martin Buber say something like, when two people relate to each other, God is present?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to first of all, yes, thank you for saying that there is a way of gazing at the other. There's a relation to the other, the I-thou relationship, as Martin Buber puts it, that speaks to a real, deep, authentic, essential engagement with the other. And there's a way also in which we can relate to other people that is does not reach that depth level, but actually allows for some distance between the others. So yes, this is very Buberian, to use that somewhat pretentious sounding word, but thank you for catching that. And we're going to close on a text that is not from him, but we'll brush up against that. Anybody else want to get in there? Going once, going twice.
Fuff has her hand up.
Who does?
Fuff does, and now.
Oh, go ahead, Fuff. Go ahead, Fuff. I didn't see you up there. Yeah, go ahead.
That's okay. Can I make a comment about what we were discussing earlier, or do you want me to, or is this just on the
Sure,
text
yeah. Try to make it, try to keep it at 30 seconds to a minute.
Okay. I think it's very important right now at this moment in history that for anybody, particularly people who have children, you need to push back on your institutions, because I did not grow up in a white neighborhood. I grew up in San Francisco, but it really was not until I got to university that I learned about the history of our own country. And right now there are 11 states, just as an example, that are officially defunding what's called critical race theory, having to do with teaching about slavery, about lynching. And I think that it's important that we ask teachers, we ask people that, if you work, what are you doing for diversity, equity, inclusion, that we really get something quantifiable. And I know, because I had a son at PJA, I had asked the head of school there years ago to put up a picture of Jews come in all colors from the Jewish Multiracial Network, because there had been some really racist epithets from a couple of PJA students towards others who were attending there.
Okay.
And
right.
we needed to expand the Mishkan to include all. And it's uncomfortable and it maybe causes conflict, but I think that's also what we need to do in the interest of everything.
Thank you for grounding us in the present, Fuff, as you do, and with your big heart and mind. You're grounding us in the reality of the now. So I'm going to, so there's a very, very important Jewish thinker who many of you will know and many of you will not know, who's extraordinarily difficult to read, but well worth it. And his name is Emmanuel Levinas. Levinas is important not only because he's not important just as a Jewish thinker. He's a really, really important 20th century thinker in philosophy and in ethics. And he's a tough read. But if you want to dip your toe in the water and get Levinas's take on his relationship to his own Jewish tradition, there's a book called Difficult Freedom. And I want to share a quotation from Difficult Freedom that talks about this. And then I'm going to try to wrap all of this up into some kind of crazy conclusion. So I'll read this because it's a bit difficult. So this is from his collection of essays called Difficult Freedom. The direct relation with the true, okay? When he says the true, he means like big truth, capital T, can only be the relation with a person with another, right? That is the relationship between two people. If there's an account of the big capital T truth that doesn't involve the relationship between human beings, it can't be true. The Torah is given in the light of a face. The Torah is given in the light of a face. The epiphany of the other person is ipso facto my responsibility toward him. So Levinas was great and he needed an editor. He wrote in French, this is in English. He doesn't have to be it actually should be called Very Difficult Freedom, because there's his difficulty and then there's the difficulty of reading it. It doesn't have to be as difficult as it is, but it is what it is. So the epiphany of the other person, that is upon seeing the other person at certain moments, our sense of the normal is ruptured because we truly take account that they are somehow an essential part of our lives. They're not secondary, they're equal to us and they're essential. And that's an epiphany, an awareness of our purpose and who we truly are. And seeing the other, we become aware of that. We have an epiphany. And that epiphany is that I have a responsibility to you. If I can see you and I view you as irrelevant and secondary, or I view you as being in my way or messing with my dreams of living my own life as I want, then I don't really get it. I'm not really understanding what it means to be a person, because to see you properly is to understand that I have a responsibility to you. Seeing the other is already an obligation towards him. Seeing the other is already an obligation towards him. I'm going to skip the sentence and I'm just going to go down here. To hear a voice speaking to you when you talk to me is ipso facto to accept the obligation towards the one speaking. When we heard George Floyd's voice calling for his mother, saying that he couldn't breathe, all of us understood that we had an obligation, that somehow we had failed, though we hadn't been there. Something in us had a responsibility to him that we were desperate to address. Consciousness is the urgency of a destination leading to the other person, and not an eternal return to self. Put in perhaps more accessible language, what it means to fulfill ourselves is not to go up to Mount Sinai or to an ashram or to a cave in the wilderness and to meditate and to become one with ourselves and one with God. That, from a Jewish perspective, that is nonsense. What it means to achieve ultimate revelation, to have the truest understanding of who we are and what it means to be a human being, is to confront the other and to properly relate to our responsibility to them. That is what Torah is. That is the two cherubim looking at each other. That is the instinct that allowed Moses to transform history. That is the meaning of God creating every human being, B'Tselem Elohim. And that is what it is to accept revelation. And the challenge is then not just to know that that is true, or even to believe that that is what is at the core of Torah, but to understand that that's in the Torah and then to act upon it, because that is something altogether different. There's something that is present at the moment of our confrontation of the other, when we saw George Floyd, right? And it cracks our heart open, and we can suddenly see the truth. And yet there is that moment when we know, at that moment, we know I am my brother's keeper. And there's somehow the difficulty of being a human being is that suddenly that clarity turns into a question. As soon as we then turn to live our ordinary lives, we begin to ask, am I really my brother's keeper? And taking that moment of revelation and putting it into mitzvah, into the work of our hands, is what everything depends on. That's what the entire redemption depends on, the ability to make that connection between heart and hands, to transform that seeing into the work of doing. And I want to suggest that that is truly at the essence of Torah and truly at the essence of revelation. And if we are to stand at Mount Sinai, as we are trying to do tonight at Shavuot, we have to draw that lesson into it and open our hearts and allow our hearts to inform the work of our hands and to remake the world in light of the fact that we can now see that the other is us. So thank you. I apologize I talked so very much, but I wanted to share that ridiculous number of texts with you. And I thank you for your insights and your attention. And now let's all take a breath after that very intense tour through the Talmud and the Torah and the Midrash. Take a deep breath. Let's all look at a mirror. She literally just stuck her tongue out. I'm gonna share one other thing with you, and then we're gonna light candles. So you might want to get your candles ready. And the Sturtzes, I'm gonna turn it over to you in one moment. But we did something this morning in davening, and I want to just do it once more with you, because certainly what we're all thinking about tonight, what I'm thinking about is what's happening in Israel. And I'm not going to pretend to address that, but I'm just going to say that what's essential is that we have hope and a vision for the future. Rabbi Nachman says there's no despair in the world at all. And I've always understood that bizarre teaching, because so evidently there is despair. But I think what he meant is, you may have despair in your heart, you may have despair in your mind, but that's because you've separated yourself from the world. The world itself, if we truly can connect to it and to God's vision of it, there's no despair. So there's only hope. Od Yishama be'ar Yehuda uvechutzot Yerushalayim. Od Yishama be'ar Yehuda uvechutzot Yerushalayim, ko sason v'ko simcha, ko chatan v'ko kala, ko sason v'ko simcha, ko chatan v'ko kala, ya la 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 ya ya, ya la 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 ya 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 di ya ya la 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 ya 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 ay 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 di ya la 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 ya 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 ya. Yet again there shall be heard in the cities of Yehuda and the streets of Yerushalayim the voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, the voice of the Jew, the voice of the Muslim, the voice of the Christian, the voice of the person who is secular, the voice of every human being being glad and rejoicing once again in the peace of Jerusalem. I want to turn it over now to my beloved friends, the Sturtzes, Rob and Sarah, who were so sad or, well, I'll just say I'm delighted that you're here. I love having you here, and I'm delighted that you will be guiding us in the lighting of the candles. And for others who have candles, you're welcome to grab them now.
I look too soon.
Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lahadlik ner shel Yom Tov.
Amen. Amen. Now, please join us together in the recitation of the Shehechianu. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Shehechianu v'kiddushanu v'heyanu la'azman hazeh. By the way, thank you to the Sturtzes, and I just want to say, the two of you, just magnificent members of our community. You are models of giving, models of heart. I think that you've shown up in every opportunity you've had to show up for our shul. You've shown up, and whether it's just being the 10th person for Minyan or the first person for Minyan, and volunteering for committees, lending your wisdom, supporting the shul financially, and in every other way, just incredible members of the community. We love you, and thank God for Zoom, because we know that we can look forward to being able to see you. So thank you for leading us in the candle lighting.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Yasher Koach.
Yasher Koach, and we love you too.
All right. It's a love fest. I want to say that I want to apologize to Natan and Chaim, because it sounds like I may have confused the timing of this thing. So I don't know what we worked out. I don't know if Natan and Chaim talked to each other. If not, then we'll just go ahead with as planned, which is Chaim.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna talk for a while about Tzedakah, and Natan will be up next, I believe.
Okay, wonderful. So sorry, let me just say by way of introduction. So I asked Chaim,
who's an awesome guy, and I had a chance to learn with him a lot. Chaim is a financial advisor, and though this is not supposed to be a commercial for Chaim, this is a guy who does a lot of Jewish learning around what his professional work is, and he did a very deep dive on Jewish teaching as it relates to tzedakah, because he wanted to understand it for his work, and that became the basis for what he's going to teach tonight. So I asked him if he would share some of what he learned and what his takeaway was about what the Jewish tradition has to say about tzedakah and how it affects our own lives and our own giving. So Chaim, take it away when you're ready.
Excellent. So yeah, my name's Chaim. Know many of you, and I'll just introduce kind of my background here with this topic a little bit. An investment advisor. I have kind of a strange role in the financial world. For an investment advisor, I get to be involved in some pretty complicated planning situations just by the nature of what I do. Charity, so-called, that's always been a challenging topic for any advisor in my position. And I started out as an investment advisor, not as somebody living a Jewish life. I've actually been an advisor longer than I've been in this community. So it's a big honor to be here talking about this topic, because these are two things that have actually really dovetailed in my life. And this is oddly kind of my own journey with Torah, is this exact topic. So it's really cool to have the opportunity to talk about it. So yeah, my background with that is being in a position to tell people what to do with their money. And so charities are really something that I get asked about a lot. And the little blurb that I came up with for this talk was kind of placing incentive and Torah, juxtaposing these two ideas, as I do see them sometimes in tension in modern life. And that's what was really interesting to me here. And so what I mean by incentive, I'll just kind of give you the background of what happens in a normal situation with charity these days. As an advisor, we're kind of on the front line of people come to ask us what to do with their money, and how this usually goes. It is somebody goes to their accountant, their advisor, their estate planner. They say, I want to give exactly enough money to maximize the incentives that I have. And there's nothing really wrong with that way of thinking. That's how most people approach the topic. And the kind of core of that is saying, look, if it's all equal, I would rather have my money go to something that I feel good about than to just the government. Otherwise, it would go to fund all kinds of things. And depending on your political perspective, it doesn't matter which one you have. There's definitely going to be stuff you don't like. The government does. And so as long as it's all equal, people would love to direct what they can towards what they care about. And your accountant says, well, there's almost no incentive. In reality, people will say, well, I heard on OPB that the Koch brothers pay no taxes, and I want to do that too. And I heard they do that with charity. And we have to say that's not really what's going on. You have to be really rich to lose money on that level where you can make money by losing money. And so that kind of ends the conversation a lot of times. And early in my career, that's where it would end. Is I would just kind of leave it there of well, if that's really what you wanted to know, now I've given you some pretty bad news that you're not going to save very much money. And I started to get really uncomfortable with that idea the more I started studying Torah. And something really interesting happened today. Actually, a client of mine drove all the way from California up here to talk to me today in Oregon, and said, I told him I was going to be talking about this, and he said, well, it's not charity if you get a tax break. And I relate to that. And that's kind of what we're going to be maybe talking a little bit about. And so, yeah, that's how the usual incentive process goes, is people are interested in knowing what they can get a benefit for. And I want to kind of juxtapose that with some Hebrew text. And it's going to be the first text I share here. It's this one from Shulchan Aruch, and it is good to give tzedakah before praying. And a very, very terse text from Shulchan Aruch. That's literally all there is to this entire very large idea and category of law is good to give tzedakah before praying. And I think that's probably not necessarily adequate for a lot of people. So I actually found a good commentary on that from Mishnah Torah, which is here. And that is this quote about why people would give money before praying, because Shulchan Aruch just says to do it. And that's a good idea. But we actually have this idea that the reason that we would do that is that when you do that, you encounter God in the prayer process in justice, b'tzedek, justified. And that's a really interesting idea. Kind of gets to the heart of what tzedakah is versus maybe some other ideas about what charity is. That justice and tzedakah are linked. They really are righteousness, justice, tzedakah. These are three intertwined ideas that word tzedakah really means righteousness. And so I want to get into a much more complicated text, and probably going to get people's kind of reactions to this one, because this is one of the texts that I personally have struggled with the most when I first encountered it. This is a text from Rabbi Nachman's book, Likutei Moharan. I found it very challenging. This is a very an idea about what it means to give that is very challenging to an American, somebody who grew up in American capitalism. This I really struggled with this for a long time and still do. But the text is, for charity is itself a product of mishpat, and that word mishpat, it means justice. As in Psalm 75:8, the Lord is judge. He brings down one and lifts up another. He impoverishes one and enriches another. And when a person gives charity, it corresponds to brings down one and lifts up another. He brings down one because he subtracts from his own money, and he lifts up another because he enriches the poor man. Consequently, through this, he embraces the attribute of mishpat. And I think the reason, one reason I find this so challenging, is going to be a follow-on text here after this, but I do want to explore this one itself a bit. One thing that really came up for me when encountering this text is that now, if it's just to give away from what you have and what you've received, what you've accumulated, what you've earned, was it unjust for you to have earned it in the first place? That's the really interesting thing in this text that I first got really hung up on. And I have a good friend who's a Hasidic student of Torah, really studies also Rabbi Nachman extensively. I said, is Rabbi Nachman a communist? Like, what am I missing in this text? This freaks me out. That was my initial reaction. And, you know, he kind of dismissed it and said, oh, no, there's a lot more going on here. You need to look at it for a lot longer. And I did that. And so we'll kind of follow on to that in a second. But first, we just want to talk about this very first sentence here, mishpat, and how righteousness, tzedakah, giving charity, is a product of justice. And I think there's a lot of people in modern discourse around economics and spirituality that would link this to social justice. And, you know, that's one idea that comes up. But the interesting thing about the word mishpat, or used to thinking of it, it actually comes up in the morning prayers and actually in the Amidas where it is, talking about judges. And so judges, justice, we're kind of used to thinking about that in a, you know, we're in this chaotic free world where we're all actors, we're acting, we're doing stuff, we're all acting in our own interests. And then we've got these guys who kind of call balls and strikes, and they level the playing field when needed, but mostly don't. And that's kind of an American justice paradigm. But the interesting thing here is that for Rabbi Nachman, and the way he sees the world, and also the way that Torah thinks about justice and righteousness, these things are not really distinct. In the view of Torah, it views itself as a foundational concept of what justice is on a deep, you know, ontological level. And so there isn't this great distinction between justice and righteousness. And these words are really intrinsically linked. And that's where I like to draw this distinction between incentive-driven thinking about giving and Torah's idea, and here Rabbi Nachman's idea about giving, that this goes way beyond what do I get to write off or not. This gets to a just world. And yeah, I find that really interesting. I still find it challenging. I'm still struggling with this text, and it's kind of why I wanted to share it. Is I kind of want to hear other people's ideas about it, and so kind of like maybe open this up for questions, comments, conversation in a moment. Yeah, but yeah, actually, maybe this a good time to do that if anybody does have a comment on that. And can't exactly see.
Oriana had I guess I'll be the okay. I'll be the judge here. Oriana had a question.
Well, it wasn't really a question. It was more a statement about Likutei Maharan. I think that I think it was this week's Parsha or last week's Parsha, that everything belongs to God. It doesn't belong to us. And so it's mishpat. If, you know, we don't own anything, we own it to share, to make sure it's distributed fairly. And I think mishpat is also about deen and fairness. And so that's where I would plug into that. And by the way, I'm not part of your community, but I heard Rabbi Rose teach last Shavuot, Simcha Bunim, and I was really impressed. And every now and then I try to catch up with you, and was happy to see things happening in your shul. I live in Eugene. Thank you.
Oh, nice. Wonderful to have you with us. Thank you so much. I see Amira has a question, but I'm going to let's go Harvey and then Amira.
Okay. I just want to say that I know you're aware of this, but I just want to clarify it. Capitalism is not the be-all and the end-all, okay? There are other kinds of economic philosophies that don't necessarily include capitalism as a legitimate way to be. That's all I wanted to say.
He's hip to that, but I think it's the best one for a financial advisor, and it's the one we have. But no.
Well, yeah, that actually is. Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead. Sorry, Chaim.
Oh yeah, that's interesting because I do kind of my own background in the financial world, and why I say I have this kind of a weird role. I am part of a group that is anti-capitalist finance people, is just weird as that sounds, called Asset to the Resistance. You can look us up. We're in Portland, ARPDX. And yeah, so I'm very interested in that idea. I get asked a lot, well, as an investment advisor, how do you understand anti-capitalist investing? And a lot of times I actually come back to Torah and say, well, Torah is very interested in what we do with our resources and is very interested in how we invest in ourselves and our communities. And that's a great deal older than capitalism. So it makes sense to me that people, you still want to think about how you're investing, even if you're not actually invested in modern economic system of America.
I love that. Excellent. Harvey, thank you for that great question, and Chaim for the wonderful answer. Maya and then Mickey.
I just wanted to, I used to be an executive assistant, and part of my job was to help a woman who had a lot of money donate to charity. And, but it was interesting because it was like being put in, I was watching sort of throughout the year her being put in this position of being inundated by requests and like mailers, and like anybody knows, if you donate once to somebody, you get like 10 mailers throughout the year, even if you already donated. But it became overwhelming to the point where it was like she was put in the position of being the judge of like, how do I judge who to help, and not wanting to do that in a certain way. And I think that's interesting because it's like in a position where you have a lot to give, you can become stressed about being the judge.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
It sort of reminded me of that. Who is she going to help, and who is she going to not lift up? Yeah.
Right. Really interesting.
That's there's a great book that sadly I wasn't organized enough for this event to bring it into the kind of docket of texts I wanted to talk about. But it's called Ahavas Chesed by the Chafetz Chaim, and is very much interested in solving exactly that question. He kind of comes up with a matrix of decision making based on some comments from Rambam, from Maimonides, on how have communities effectively understood caring for themselves economically, who kind of is triaged, how are our resources used, and it's a really interesting text, and actually I see a lot of connection in kind of the heart of that great text and what Rabbi Rose was talking about earlier. Actually, it is very interested in the difference between what is a mitzvah. So what do we have to do? What are we supposed to do? And what specifically elevates us that we're doing it? And what is good to do in God's name for the broader world? And there are many instances in which giving to communities outside of the Jewish community actually come up as glorifying God's name, the Shem Tov.
Right. We've got there's some kind of conspiracy of the M's here. We've got Maya, Mickey, and then Miles. Mickey, and then Miles.
Am I up?
Yeah, you're up.
I just want to say that I don't think that most people who give charity, tzedakah, see it as I'd rather give it to this cause than the government. I'm sure there are many people who are that way, but I think most people want to help a cause or an organization or people, and I think that is the incentive that most folks who give charity have. And it just came to me that to tie it in with what you said, Rabbi Rose, a little while ago, Hashomer Achi Anochi, am I my brother's keeper? Yes, we do have a responsibility to help, to take care of our brothers and to see the humanity in others. And maybe I'm being overly naive, but I think that most folks who give tzedakah, charity, they're happy to get a tax deduction, but I don't think that's the reason that they're giving, and I don't think most people stop when their financial benefit ends. So that's my 2 cents.
Got it.
Yeah, and there
Okay,
is that's a really great point, and there's kind of a selection bias in like who comes to somebody like me and wants to talk about that. It happens to be somebody who is thinking about that, or goes and talks to their CPA, their accountant. So they're, I have kind of a weird perspective on it, because that is usually the conversation. But there's also the fact that a specific type of person is looking for, somebody like me in the first place, and it's not necessarily the person. Sometimes it is, and sometimes it isn't. That, like you mentioned, it has incentives that are non-financial.
Great. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Mickey. Miles, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just wondering whether there are Jewish sources that speak to the question of whether a given amount of tzedakah given without any external incentive is fundamentally to be preferred to the same amount of tzedakah given but with some other incentive, whether it's the social incentive of everyone seeing what a great tzedakah giver you are, or whether there's a tax break involved. Does it actually matter from, because I've never been troubled by the idea that we would reward financially to some degree through tax breaks the giving of tzedakah or giving of charitable donation. But do the Jewish sources speak to the question of whether that is, like, for example, maybe as a Jew, I should not take the tax deduction and that I could get with a donation, and that would somehow be a more elevated form of giving than if I allowed myself to accept the reward that the government offers?
That's a really good question. That I'm not in. What I'll reference is some response from the modern Orthodox world in regard to taxes, because people are very interested in the conversation of our taxes fulfilling this obligation. And that's been discussed in great depth. And there are people who have maybe convincingly made the argument that some part of it actually is tzedakah, and there's charts that you can find, and they're very interesting. X amount of your tax dollars actually go to social programs, so you can like count this 5% as part of your tzedakah, and this part isn't, and this part, and it actually gets pretty in depth, because well, for one thing, in the Orthodox world, you do have a lot of people who are very worried about transgressing the cap on how much you can give in tzedakah, which is considered to be about 20% of your annual income. And so if you're paying a great deal more than 20% of your income in taxes, how much can you even give without transgressing that if taxes are tzedakah. So yeah, there is actually some really interesting writing on that topic of, well, is it wrong to get the incentive? And most of the rabbis who have commented on that have said no, there isn't actually anything wrong with getting an incentive. In fact, when Rambam was writing on who gets preference, like if you're creating a flow chart of who in your sphere should be getting tzedakah from you, it actually should be a family member. It should be literally your brother. And he says, because then he references a text where it says your brother, and he interprets that quite literally, your brother, then your cousin, and there's a whole kind of list of who's in line from your own family. And that definitely has implied incentive, of course. And so that's maybe what I'd have to say about that.
Really interesting. Miles, I also don't have a full answer to that, but there is in the discussion in the Gemara, in Ketubot, and it turns out that in Ketubot, there are all of these texts that become really essential to the study of tzedakah. And one thing that does not really address directly what you're saying, but it brushes up against it, is there is a discussion about a Rav Meir. I think it's Rav Meir would give tzedakah anonymously. Like he would take great pains to like slip tzedakah into the little mailbox of the poor person and like run away so he could give anonymously, because we all know that's a value. And his wife was at home like making challah or whatever it was that the wife was expected to do at that time. And the poor would come by her house and just ask her for money, and she would look at them in the eye and be like, here's the tzedakah. And there's a weird story, but the upshot of the story is that she is seen as being more righteous because she actually looks the person in the eye, which does not address your question, but it kind of connects to the theme that I introduced before. It's a great question you asked. I do appreciate it.
There's also Rambam, 8 levels of charity.
Say that again, sorry.
There's Rambam's 8 levels of charity.
Right, sure.
Yeah, which is another text, sadly, I kind of had to focus on, okay, what text am I going to bring up? Because there's so many.
You've chosen great texts. Sorry, let me just slip in one other thing about Rabbi Nachman. So it turns out that tzedakah, and tzedakah is a huge deal for Rabbi Nachman, because tzedakah represents this, it has a spiritual power. It represents the flow of divine gifts into the world. And so for those who are interested, if you want to learn about tzedakah, Rabbi Nachman can be a really, really powerful source to talking about the centrality of tzedakah in the life of the Jewish community. All right, Chaim, I think those are the questions. Back to you.
Cool. Actually, that's a really good lead into my next comment about this text, which is that kind of the background of this text and what this book even is. It's kind of this very interesting assortment of his commentary on many different texts. So it's this really weird, difficult to read book where it's a long flow of many quotes and many commentaries. But the theme is the tzaddik, the righteous person. And so here I'm kind of interpreting his interest in tzedakah throughout this book, and there are many, many comments on it. He is kind of riffing on this idea of tzaddik, tzedakah, which are related words, righteousness, righteous person. And his ultimate kind of goal of his theology is to support and find and draw people to the righteous person for leadership. And the interesting thing with this text and Moshe and that idea to me is that this imagery of a person coming down to lift people up, to me, really is evocative of Moses coming down from Sinai to to lead the people. He, was in this. You can only imagine, or I like to imagine, what it would have been to been up there. You're on Mount Sinai, and then you have to, leave that present and come down and deal with people. And that is exactly, I think, kind of some of the ethos that he's talking about here. And I think that's maybe some of the connection between tzedakah he is trying to make, which I find very interesting. Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And also that with viewing himself as tzaddik and the other Rebbes as tzaddikim, that they were also vessels for this. Oriana, you still have a digital hand up. Is that left over from before, or you have another question?
I took it down, and I just didn't want this session to end without, I know it wasn't a professional plug, but I would be curious how to look him up at another time. Chaim, if you're willing to give contact information.
Yeah, Chaim Investment Advisors. That's really where you'll find me.
I'll throw it in the chat.
Thank you.
And so back to this question of like, if it is good to give away, is it bad to receive? That's something that I'm really interested in, because I kind of take on some of the existential struggles of my clients. Sometimes I have a very consultative role with them, and people will often talk to me because they know I'm really into spirituality, about some of their problems with earning a lot of money. Sounds like a great problem to have, but it is one that people are really interested in. And I was really interested in it with this text because, I was like, wow, should I be sharing this text above with people? Is that going to freak them out way too much? And so I struggled with this for some time and made it through more of this great book. And this is a super obscure looking quote that is mostly not exactly related to what we're talking about. And this is, an example of kind of how out there this book really gets. He is, without any real context, just commenting on a very strange parable from Talmud, but embedded in this text is something really interesting to me, where he says, "But by giving charity, they are rectified, and abundance is drawn into the world." And so I would think, kind of extrapolate from this comment, that no, I don't think Rabbi Nachman is saying, well, don't earn any money so that you don't have to give it away and feel bad about it. I think he's saying from here that actually giving charity draws abundance into the world, which is an idea that I've always been very interested in with Torah. One of the first Torah studies I ever did was actually around this time of year, and was around the word Omer. And that's why this is a great text for me to be talking about on this holiday. The idea that if you have to give something as a sacrifice, are you really being economically burdened? Was it a hardship for the Israelites when they came into the land to have to be giving these agricultural sacrifices? And in my view, and in my studies of economics, that's kind of one thing that I probably study a little more than these texts, sadly. That generally holds to be true, even as non-intuitive as it sounds. There's a great book all about this topic and American finance called The Strategic Dividend Investor. It doesn't sound like it would be very interesting, relevant to this exact topic, but it is. He talks about companies that have to think about giving money to their shareholders are more financially well than companies that don't, by a huge measure. And there is maybe some connection between needing to have abundance to be giving out and actually doing well. And yeah, so I found that to be a really interesting idea, that charity is not about totally bringing yourself down to the point where you're impoverished. And that's why so many strictures on how much we do charity are in place, is that, no, that's not actually the point. The point is for us to do well, in my view.
Miles has his hand up. I don't know if there are others, but I see Miles.
Yeah, so I love this, and you know, Shefa is abundance, but you could really view this paragraph in terms of Keynesian economic theory. If you increase the velocity of money through an economy, the money is basically as a multiplier effect on the overall economic activity in the economy and everybody's well-being. So you know, if you give charity and people give charity from that, you're basically spreading the wealth through the community, but it multiplies beyond just the raw dollar amount, because each time the money is exchanged in a transaction, it basically increases the wealth to a greater degree than simply the exchange itself. So that's a very poor representation of the overall theory, but it does fit with modern economic theory in an interesting way.
It does, yeah, and that's kind of the labor side economics, and yeah, I can see the connection there. There's a great essay by Rabbi Elliot Dorff, and I'm almost just not going to quote it because it's such a great essay. I'm going to totally butcher it because it's been a year since I've read it, but he's very much interested in that idea, the thesis of, and he correct me if I'm wrong, is he still the chief rabbi of the conservative
Well,
movement?
yeah, I right. So the short answer is I don't know. He was and may still be serving as the head of the what is it called, CJALS, Conservative Jewish Lawmaking halachic body. I don't know if he still plays that role, but he's still active. Yeah, great scholar of conservative Judaism.
Yeah, but his whole thesis was, you know, Torah has a very wide range of economics that can work and still be Jewish, but it has a lot to say about how we do that well. We could be more self-directed, more self-interested, and there's a kind of limit to what that is in his view, in Torah's view, and there's also maybe some limits on how top down we can be, and that's why it's a really interesting and challenging essay.
Yeah, great. I love I have no idea, Miles, what you said, but I could tell by watching Chaim's reaction that it meant something. So I just love this group of people. So the other thing I just wanted to point out quickly that I know you don't have time to, it's 9 p.m. So I know you don't have time to go into this, but the word shefa, which as Miles pointed out is reasonably translated here as abundance, generally certainly in Kabbalah, refers to sort of a spiritual abundance, and sometimes overlaps with material abundance, and other times is sort of seems to be used in a way that's maybe independent of material abundance. So there's just an interesting idea there that it might be, one might read this text to suggest that like giving tzedakah doesn't necessarily help material abundance flow, in spite of what Keynes says, but it does help no matter what. It helps the kind of spiritual energy and well-being and spiritual abundance flow. But I love this text that you chose.
Yeah, and then I definitely had no idea how much time it would take to get through those texts, so I figured they would maybe be a lot of the time. So I do have some other texts, but probably not going to get super deep into them. One thing that I wanted to kind of juxtapose those ideas with and kind of maybe bring it all back around is Koheles, which I am very interested in as a text that comments on economics and wealth, because Ecclesiastes, Koheles, is very concerned with what happened living as somebody who is maybe not all that concerned about why he was accumulating wealth. It just kind of happens, and he's very involved with it, and that's what his life meaning is as it's going. But it's written, Ecclesiastes, as this backwards looking text on, well, I did this, but what does it mean now? And many of the commentaries, and I've read a great deal of the commentaries, some of them very old, some of them more modern on that. A lot of times the rabbis who have commented on this have confronted the kind of existential aspect of Ecclesiastes, which is somewhat unsettling, by talking about tzedakah. And that's is an interesting text, because that's how people have grappled with, what is he really saying? Is he saying it's bad to have money? And the rabbis have said, well, it's not bad to have, but you got to focus on bringing abundance into the world, kind of riffing on what Rabbi Nachman was saying. And you, it's okay to enjoy wealth, but you also need to be doing it in the spirit of Torah. And so, yeah, I find that really interesting. This text here, I withheld from my eyes nothing they asked for and denied myself no enjoyment. Rather, I got enjoyment out of all my wealth, and that was all I got out of my wealth. And that, as an advisor, I have read that probably, 100 or more times, and really struggled with this exact sentence, because so often my job is to help people just have a lot of wealth. And I have to grapple with, okay, but why are we doing this in this situation? I often need to bring that up with people, because sometimes there can be kind of imbalanced reasons for that to be the case. And I like to explore that topic with people.
Hold on, I note that Miles has a question. I just want to briefly just note how fascinating it is to hear you talk about, your process as a professional. Like, on the one hand, you have your people are coming to you not because they necessarily want ethical or spiritual advice. They want to maximize their gain. And as you struggle as a Jew and as an individual, a person of conscience and deep thought, with like what, with the deeper levels of what you're doing in the world, it's really fascinating to hear your process. And I'm sure sometimes it's really stressful. Miles, you have a question? And sorry, Chaim, you can choose whether you have time to take the question or not. You've got probably another like 7-8 minutes.
If this is off topic, just say, don't want to talk about it. Tithing, forgive me but I don't understand. What is the relationship of tithing to tzedakah? I think of it as mandatory taxation versus voluntary self-taxation. Is that a right framework? Is tithing also tzedakah?
Tithing is the, so there's two parts to the ideal tzedakah in the way that is construed in Shulchan Aruch. Ramah Moshe Saris, who wrote Shulchan Aruch or commented on it, he said there's two parts. There's wealth, and then there's the flow of money, basically. So the wealth part, when you are first an adult, and I think it's really construed as like when you like get a windfall in life, you really kind of become an adult financially, and that might be you inherited money or something like that. You would give a fairly large amount, so like more than 20% or 20% of that away. And then the tithe is the part that is happening consistently every year. And so then every year you would give 10%. And he's talking about this because he does not want people to get the idea. It says give 20% of your wealth away. It doesn't want that to be construed as like every year you give 20% of your wealth away, because you would all be gone pretty fast. And so the tithe is the income-based percentage that's happening on an ongoing basis. And then there's a third piece, which he doesn't talk about a lot for reasons of being worried about bad luck, which is, you know, when you die, that's a whole other conversation, which is a really interesting conversation. And Talmud is many great commentaries on what that should look like, but that is a totally different figure. So you really have three different figures.
Thank you. I have so many more questions for you on that, but I won't ask them here because other people have questions.
Yeah, I guess we should kind of open it up for more questions and commentaries, because yeah, I just have, you know, more Kohelet to talk about otherwise, and we've kind of introduced that idea. Cool. Actually, I think I kind of wasn't great at building this Sefaria list. So it's a bunch of repeats of a lot of the same text. So yeah, I guess I will kind of conclude some of my ideas here, where we have, yeah, like I said, in my experience, so much conversation happens around what do you get out of the charity, the tzedakah process. We have Rabbi Nachman has so many great thoughts on acting as a tzaddik, acting as a righteous person through the act of giving. And we have a good juxtaposition in Ecclesiastes, who didn't do that and is now very worried about it. Or some people would say he did, but some rabbis have said he actually didn't give tzedakah, and that's why he feels so bad. One I read, and I'm forgetting who, and that was a really interesting text.
Yeah. Really interesting.
Yeah.
I want to just say that, you know, there is something about tzedakah that is so fascinating, because it is like in some ways the embodiment. And I guess maybe I'm drawing on Rabbi Nachman here, although I'm decabbalizing it, but tzedakah is in some way like the embodiment of the larger spiritual project, in that you have these things that are yours or that are of you, and a human being has the choice as to how much to release oneself into the world, whether it's money, which is the manifestation of so much other things, of ideas in relationship to the other, and one's heart and love and emotion. And tzedakah is like the material expression of all of these other things, of human connection, and of course the unity of those who worship God, the togetherness and the mutual responsibility of those who serve God is essential to the whole project. And so tzedakah really captures that in a way. And Chaim, the way that you led us through the kind of halachic dimensions of this, but also the deeper dimensions and implications of it, is absolutely fascinating. And if I'm not mistaken, people can read about your reflections on this on your, like, you have this as part of your professional website, right?
Yeah, I talk a lot about Ecclesiastes and wealth, and this kind of become a series that I write about, because I revisit the text so often. So yeah, the Ecclesiastes investor, that's how I talk about that. And yeah, it's actually one of my favorite things to write about. I'm going to be writing another one very soon about this exact text, where he says, I got enjoyment out of all my wealth, and that was all I got out of my wealth. Revisiting that through the lens of time, because time and wealth are actually really related in an important way, and I have never really addressed that in the way that Ecclesiastes talks about wealth, and I think that'll be a really cool one.
So great. And so I know that I think Maya put it into the chat, but just say one more time, what's your website if people want to, oh, there it is.
Yeah.
So Maya just put the link into the chat for those who want to read Chaim's work. Chaim, I'm so grateful to you for, I mean, not only for teaching tonight, but also just for how seriously you take Torah in your life and how you like really are putting it to work in your values, in your professional life. It's really a beautiful, beautiful model of what it's all about. The learning you've done and the application of it to choices you're making in your life as a professional. So thank you so much for everything you've done here. Really, really inspiring.
Yasher koach.
Yasher koach to you.
I am in awe of your contribution. I really am.
Thank you.
Can't say it better than that. So Natan Meir, where are you, Natan? I don't see you, but I know you're here. Oh, there you are. So I want to encourage everybody to we're going to take a 60-second body break by just staying where you are, but standing up and just kind of stretching, so we can open our minds a little bit and make sure that what Natan's going to share with us will land and you'll be able to focus on it. Let's get a close-up shot of Amira just because she's so dang cute. I'm going to pin, well, I don't know if now everybody can see her because I just pinned her to my big stretches as we head in to the second part of the final stretch of the evening. Before Natan teaches, I'm going to put into my hold on, where did I put? I'm going to put the link in for after Natan is done. I want to make sure that I don't forget to do this, so I'm going to put the link into the chat here. Whoopsie, hold on a second. Let me try that again. The link I just put in there is the link for the Rabbinical Assembly Tikkun Leil Shavuot, which is, people all over the country will have access to it. And I will then also paste in the entire email that I had that contains that link if you're interested. But in any event, that link that begins tinyurl.com should take you where you need to go. I am very, very blessed to have Natan Meir as a congregant, but also as somebody who I can count as one of my friends. Portland is extraordinarily lucky to have this guy. Sherry Torah is extraordinarily fortunate to have this person as part of our community. And Natan wrote a book, which I suspect he might mention if we ask him nicely, just to that was recognized as part of the, oh, now I'm going to mess this up. It was honored as part of the National Jewish Book Award. I don't know exactly what the name of the honor is, but Natan's a heavy hitter and a wonderful mensch and a wonderful contributor to our community. And I'm very grateful that he has agreed to teach on this evening of Shavuot. And so, Natan, with that, I turn it over to you. And I believe that you've already been made a co-host, but I'll double check that just in case you need to share texts. And I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi Rose.
Yeah.
Chag Sameach, everyone.
Chag Sameach.
Nice to see everyone.
Oh, there you go. Now you are a co-host. Okay. Great.
Thank you. So it's great to see a whole bunch of people on here. I know it's late in the evening and people are probably in relaxed poses by now, but if you're comfortable turning on your webcam, it would be nice to be able to see faces.
Yeah, let's do that. Sorry, let me, I just want to second what Natan said. I want to encourage folks to let us see your beautiful panim. It adds energy to us and it helps the whole group. So if you can turn on your camera, that way it'll add some energy to the group.
That's more like thanks, everyone. Now we just have to imagine that we're all in a room together, which hopefully we will be soon. I offered to teach a session tonight on a topic that I'm actually in the middle of writing an article on. I was hoping to finish the article today. I didn't quite get there, but it's almost there. And I'm doing some work these days. Rabbi Rose mentioned my previous book, which was on the outcasts of the Jewish community in Eastern Europe, called Stepchildren of the Shtetl. And I'm working on a new project, which is about Jewish magic. And I thought that I would teach tonight about this very strange magical incantation that I came across a few years ago and decided that I wanted to do some more research on. So we're gonna go through some aspects of the incantation, try to understand what it's all about, and hopefully it'll be interesting and fun. And feel free to raise your hands if you have questions at any point. I also put my text into a Safaria handout, so I'm going to share my screen and we'll go through it from there. Okay. So this is a magical incantation which was widely in use in the late 19th and early 20th century in Eastern Europe, and was probably used from at least the early 1800s, probably even further back than that, 1700s at some point. It's very difficult to set a date for it. And it's a spell which is called, well, it doesn't really have a formal title, but I call it three women. Shalosh Nashim, that would be the Yiddish or the Ashkenazic pronunciation. Shalosh Nashim, obviously in Israeli Hebrew. And this is an incantation against the evil eye, which was apparently usually used, at least from the ethnographic information that we have from the late 19th or early 20th century, when it was kind of collected by ethnographers. It was used for illness, when it was assumed that the illness had come about by means of an evil eye. Someone had cast an evil eye upon this particular person, and you needed to try to counteract that effect. And so you would call in a man or a woman who had this kind of, let's say, magical knowledge. And these were usually elderly people who had that wisdom passed on to them. Men would usually say this incantation in Hebrew. Women knew it in Yiddish. And there are two versions of it. So I have the Hebrew version here. They don't really, most of the versions don't differ that much. The Yiddish one has some other interesting things that we're not going to go into tonight, but I wanted to stick with the Hebrew. The Hebrew incantation has much more, usually many more biblical quotations in it. So that's one interesting aspect of it. And we're going to look at some of those biblical verses that are part of the incantation itself. And as you can see here, I have the incantation here, and I'll read it for you in English. You'll see the English and the Hebrew. If you read Hebrew, they're a little bit different here, but don't worry about that. I'm just dealing with a lot of different versions, and they all differ slightly. So for now, just pay attention to the English. Three women are sitting on the crag of a rock. The first says, so-and-so is sick. The second says, so-and-so is not sick. And the third says, so-and-so is not sick and will never be sick. If a man cast this evil eye on him, may the hair of his head and his beard fall out. And if a woman cast this evil eye on him, may her teeth fall out and her breasts fall off. Just as the sea is uncharted and fish and ants have no kidneys, may so and so, sorry, that should be so and so not be touched by any evil, pain, or damage, and may the evil eye have no power over him. For he is of the seed of Joseph. As it is written, Joseph is a fruitful bough by a well, whose branches run over the wall. Then Israel sang this song, Spring up, O well, sing unto it. The well the leaders sank, dug by the nation's nobles, by the lawgiver, with their staves. And from the wilderness they went to Mattanah, from Mattanah to Nachliel, from Nachliel to Bamot, and from Bamot in the valley that is in the country of Moab to the top of Pisgah, which looks down on the wasteland. Just as Hezekiah, king of Judah, was healed from his illness, so may so-and-so be healed quickly and return to his former strength by the force of the name that emerges from the acrostic, Aleph Gimel Lamed He, Atagibor Leolam Adonai. So that's essentially the incantation. As I said, there's different versions of it, but you can see that it starts there with that that first piece of 3 women stand on the crag of a rock, and that is actually the part of the incantation that intrigued me the most when I read it, because it was the only part of the incantation that had no obvious historical or religious context to it. Who are these 3 women? What's going on here? Why does this start out this way? The rest of it, you can kind of understand, because it says if so and so put a spell on so and so, then such and such should happen to them. So you're kind of laying out the curse or the return of what happens to when the evil eye comes, and it should be sent back in a particular way. And then there's all these biblical passages that are also intriguing. And so we're going to go through some of those and try to figure out what are these biblical passages doing here. And then we're going to try to understand who the 3 women are, because that for me is ultimately the most interesting part of the whole charm. Okay, so let's look first at, no, I didn't want to do that. Hold on. Okay, let's look first at Genesis 49:22. Would somebody like to volunteer to read the verse in English?
I'll go for it.
Okay, Trevor, thank you.
Joseph is a wild ass by a spring. Wild colts on a hillside.
Okay, thanks. So anyone know what the larger context of this verse is from this particular place in Genesis? Who is it that's saying this about Joseph?
Isaac blessing his children, or Jacob blessing his children?
Yes. Who's that, the rabbi?
Sorry, was that cheating? I abhor silence, so I was struggling.
I'm sorry, Rabbi, that answer is wrong. No, that's correct. It's the blessing that Jacob gives to his various sons at the end of Genesis before his death. And this is the one, and they're kind of cryptic very often, right? It's hard to figure them out. The Hebrew is difficult. And so there's many different explanations for what this Hebrew means. Ben Porat Yosef, Ben Porat Ale Ain. And this is a translation from the new JPS. So it's a pretty contemporary translation. And if you look, for example, at King James, you'll get a very different kind of translation. And it's hard to really understand what it might mean. Ben Porat Yosef, Ben Porat Ale Ain. Obviously, as you can see, the translation that we have here, which is very methodologically and sound and based on scholarship, says that it's comparing Joseph to an animal. But this particular verse has been known for millennia in Jewish culture as protecting from the evil eye. So we want to understand how that is. Why is that so? In fact, almost any amulet that you might buy when you're amulet shopping, as I'm sure you all do when you visit Israel, will have this particular verse on it. It may have many other verses, but this one is kind of the key one. So who would like to volunteer to read this passage from the Gemara? In English, in English. Let's see. Liz, how do you feel about reading?
Let me see if I can get my. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, I'm on my phone, so I'm having a hard time hearing you, but I would love to read it. Okay. The Gemara relates that Rabbi Yochanan was accustomed to go and sit at the gates of the women's immersion sites. Rabbi Yochanan, who is known for his extraordinary good looks, explained this and said, when the daughters of Israel emerge from their immersion, they will look at me and will have children as beautiful as I. The sages asked him, Master, do you not fear the evil eye? He said to them, I descend from the seed of Joseph, over whom the evil eye has no dominion. As it is written, Joseph is a beautiful vine.
That's bountiful.
I'm sorry?
That's bountiful.
Okay. Joseph is a bountiful vine on a spring. Alei ayin. Ayin can mean both spring and eye. And Rabbi Abahu said, a homiletic interpretation, do not read it ale ayin, rather ole ayin, above the eye. They transcend the influence of the evil eye.
Okay, great.
Rabbi,
that's we don't have to do that second part, that other
okay.
part, Liz. But thank you so much. That's fantastic. So, so what happened here is that, as is typical for the rabbis of the Gemara, they give a homiletic interpretation of this verse, and they say that ayin in this verse, which is this right here, ale ayin, by a spring, and ayin can also mean ayin as in an eye, right? So, but they're reading this word here, ale, a little bit differently with a different vocalization as ole ayin. And if you think of ayin as the evil eye, then ole ayin are those who are able to transcend the evil eye. And that's where we get this idea that Joseph in particular was known for his ability to ward off the evil eye. And traditionally in magic, and this is true in many faith traditions, not only in Judaism, it was understood that there were certain people who had greater power to ward off the evil eye. And that depends, of course, which categories of people, depends on which tradition we're talking about. But in this case, if you were descended from Joseph, and in a sense, everyone could claim they were descended from Joseph, or at least that was the idea, then you could say that you were, as a Jew, you were protected from the evil eye, and you would call upon this verse to help you with that. So our next text is, let me go back up to the incantation for a minute. And you can see here our first biblical proof text, our first biblical verse here is what we just read, Genesis 49:22. And I gave you here the translation, which was more traditional, both in English translations, when we look at something like the King James Version, and also in Hebrew commentaries and understandings of the biblical text. This idea that Ben Porat Yosef, Joseph is a fruitful bough. That was the kind of traditional understanding of it. And then we have the homiletical understanding that we just read from the Gemara. Then we have a very long quote from Numbers 21, which is about the well of the chieftains, as it's often called in English scholarly texts. And this is the well that we read about in this particular passage from Numbers, which has always intrigued me greatly, because when you read a scholarly commentary like the one we have in our Eitz Chaim Chumash at Shul, you'll see that one of the commentaries is that this is a very, very old portion, a very old piece of the Torah, probably one of the one of the oldest, because it's a fragment of a poem, just a fragment of some pre-existing, very ancient poem that we don't have most of anymore. And it goes, then Israel sang this song, spring up, O well, sing unto it. And this is actually the people of Israel talking to the well. And then it says, this is the well that the leaders sank, or that the leaders dug, the chieftains dug by the nation's nobles. And then there's this strange phrase about going from place to place in the wilderness, and from the wilderness to Matanah, from Matanah to Nachliel, and so on and so forth. Okay, this well became associated in the Bible. Some of you may know this, in the Torah, in the tradition, the rabbinic tradition, with one particular figure in the Exodus, in the story of the Exodus. And that figure is, anybody know?
Miriam.
Right, Miriam. So this is known as Miriam's well. And some of you may have heard this midrash, this legend about the well that actually followed the people of Israel from place to place in their wanderings. So the tradition associates this particular well with Miriam. Okay, knowing that, we can then go to our next text, which is from Targum Yonatan, which is the Targum is both a translation of the Torah into Aramaic, but it's also kind of a commentary, because it's never a literal translation. And can I have a volunteer to read the English of this particular passage?
Then behold, Israel sang the thanksgiving of this song at the time that the well, which had been hidden, was restored to them through the merit of Miriam. Spring up, O well, spring up, O well, sang they to it, and it sprang up.
Okay, thank you, Faf. So there's something very interesting happening here, which is that the well had been hidden for a time, says the commentary, or the Targum, and then it reappeared. And so that's why it's explaining why they're saying spring up, why the children of Israel are saying this particular thing to the well, and it responds to their call. And it was through Miriam's merit that it was actually brought back to them. So again, let's add that to our understanding as we move along. And we have a very, very long midrash from the Midbar Rabbah, which we're not going to read all of because of time, but I want to read parts of the midrash because I think it helps us understand the layers of meaning that go into the fact that this particular biblical verse was included in the magical incantation. Okay, the midrash is on that passage. Az Yashir Yisrael et Hashira Hazot. Then Israel sang this song, the song of the well, right? That's what it's called. This song of the well was uttered at the end of 40 years, while the well was given to them at the beginning of 40 years. That's the tradition, that the well accompanied them, as we said. So what was the purpose of writing it down here? This matter has been explained from what is above, and that's a preceding verse. It is therefore said in the book of the wars of the Lord, et vahev. And this is the particle in Hebrew, et. It's a grammatical particle. If you don't know it, don't need to worry about it. The point here is that Holy One, blessed be He, did for them signs, otot, and miracles in the Wadi Arnon, Nahal Arnon. That's a geographical feature that has water running through it, like the miracles which He did for them in the Red Sea. And then the Midrash goes on to explain certain kinds of miracles that God did for the Israelites in this particular place. We don't have to worry too much about what those miracles are. It's about the various mountains that they were traveling through. I'm just going to scroll down a little bit to the part that's relevant for us. See how long it is?
Yeah, it's long.
Okay. So what's happened up until now in the Midrash is that the text is explaining these various mountain ranges that kind of stand opposite each other. And one of the miracles was that the two mountain ranges came together and they crushed the warriors, the enemies of the Israelites who were amassing against them. So you can see here, the crags entered into the caves, right? Caves on the one side, the mountain crag on the other side, and the warriors are crushed. And then the well descended to the wadi, to that, what do we call a wadi in English? It's a seasonal stream, right? Where it became a mighty torrent and destroyed the troops, just as the Red Sea had destroyed those Egyptians. Then it cites a proof text in Numbers 21:14. And then the well descended into the caves. Remember, it's talking about the same well, Miriam's well. The water of the well descended into those caves where the warriors had been crushed and brought out innumerable skulls, arms, and legs. It's a lovely picture. Thus, when Israel returned to seek the well, they saw it coming out powerfully from the wadi, like an eruption of water, as it discharged the limbs of the troops. So imagine, this is the picture that the Midrash is painting for us, that the power of the water of the well is so strong that it runs down into this valley where this miraculous crushing of the enemies of Israelites have taken place, and then it erupts, bringing all the body parts of the Israelites with it. Okay, so it's a pretty awful image, but what I want us to bring away from this is this idea that the well of Miriam is symbolic of, or reminiscent of, the power of God to be victorious over one's enemies. And I think that's relevant here because what this charm is about, it's about trying to overcome the evil eye, which was often associated with the demonic in the magical layers of Judaism that we have mostly lost, that we don't have access to anymore in our versions of Judaism today, but which were extremely important for most Jews up until the 19th century. For many ordinary Jews, that was probably one of the aspects of Judaism that they encountered most often, especially for women, but also for men. So that magical dimension to Judaism is obviously something that intrigues me greatly, and that I'm trying to give you access to a little bit tonight in this teaching. Okay, so let's read one more text about the Well of Miriam, and then we'll go on to some non-Jewish texts. This is from a medieval book called Sefer HaOrah, which is attributed to Rashi. We don't think that Rashi actually wrote it, but it was generally from that, from medieval Ashkenaz, from medieval northern France and Western Germany. So does somebody want to read the English from Sefer HaOrah? Someone who hasn't read yet? Okay, Maya, thank you.
There once was a certain man who was struck with boils. His wife went to fetch water at Motzei Shabbat after the Sabbath had ended, and she was delayed for an hour or two. When she came home, her husband got angry at her. She got so angry that her pitcher fell and broke, and drops of water fell on his skin, and he was healed. Miriam's well was hidden in the Sea of Galilee, and every Motzei Shabbat, its water surged into all the springs and all the wells.
Okay, thanks. So this is a continuation of the rabbinic legends about the well of Miriam. And this brings it into the Middle Ages, obviously, because this tale is supposed to be more or less a contemporary tale about a woman in Christian Europe going to fill up her pitcher at the well. She comes back. This is a Saturday night. She comes back. She spent a long time there. Her husband's angry at her. She gets angry back. She's like, "Why?" You know, we could just imagine that scene, right? Why are you angry at me? I had to catch up with Miriam at the well, or with whoever it was, Rivka, or Genendel. And she gets so angry that her pitcher breaks. Some of the drops fall on his skin, and I took out the details here, but whenever a drop falls, he is healed there. Okay, and the reason this is so is because every Motzei Shabbat, every Saturday night, the well of Miriam, which by rabbinic legend actually came with the Israelites to the land of Israel and then went into the land with them and hid itself within the Sea of Galilee. And there were medieval Jews who could tell you, we have testaments of where they could see. They could stand on the shore, they could see where the well was. But the magical thing about the well in the Middle Ages was that it fed all of the streams and all of the wells and all of the springs of the world, but in a kind of, I don't know how to phrase this, a kind of random way, so that if you were lucky and you drew your water at just the right time and just the right place, you would get water from Miriam's well. So it's the imagine that. I mean, imagine thinking that this incredibly ancient, incredibly magical, what do we call it? A thing. I don't even know what to call it. That accompanied the Israelites in the biblical text. You could have access to that in Christian Europe thousands of years later. So there's a really fascinating kind of, I can't think because it's late. I'm not used to teaching late at night, but it's this palpable connection, a tangible connection that you can actually hold on to, and it might even be able to affect your life for the better. You'll be able to be healed by that water, just as your ancestors were sustained by that water for so many years in the wilderness. Okay. All right. Now, what I wanted to do there was to explain those biblical verses to you and some of the meaning behind them, why these might be included. The one about Joseph is very clear. That one we already know from the Talmud is about the evil eye. The one about Miriam's well, as I think a little bit less clear, but that's why I tried to bring these other texts to show you how medieval Jews might have thought about Miriam's well. And might have understood its power in their own lives. Also, in many magical texts, you see the use of the motif of water. It's a very powerful magical motif. So it's not surprising that would have been borrowed from ancient texts and inserted here into this magical text. But that's not, again, not only for Jewish magic, also for Christian magic and for pagan magic. And they shared many things in common. If there's anything that I've learned from my foray into Jewish magic over the past few, I don't know, weeks or months, is that the porousness of the boundaries between Judaism and Christianity here is probably at its greatest. Because ordinary people, and this is true also for Jews and Muslims in the medieval world, ordinary people, they would use whatever magic was efficacious. And often they would just take off, if Jesus's name was in there, they would just take it out. And there's even discussions in halachic texts about whether it's okay for a Christian person to recite a medical magical charm over a Jew that has the name of Jesus in it. They debated it, right? Because this happened. Jews would sometimes call for these people who were experts in magic. And again, as I said before, it didn't matter. Very often Jews would not look at Christian magic as, oh, we don't use that. That's not efficacious because we're their enemies. And Christians would not do the same for Jews. People shared magic in that way. And that's something that's very surprising to me when I first learned about it. Okay, so we have a Latin text here. I know must be people who read Latin here, so you're probably going to correct my translation, which is great. But this is basically approximate. These are magical charms from a 4th or 5th century compilation from early medieval France called De Medicamentis. These are called womb incantations because there was a particular category of magical charm that you would use around childbirth or uterine pain or generally lower abdominal pain for women. And it's a whole category of magical charm. And these two both have 3 virgins in them. Okay, so these are just excerpts. They're a little bit longer than this, not much longer, but I just wanted to give you the main pieces of them. So you can see the first one is 3 virgins placed a marble table in the middle of the sea. And you're like, why? What the hell?
Yeah, no kidding.
And the second one is the second one is even weirder. A tree stands in the middle of the sea and hanging from it is a bucket full of human intestines. 3 virgins walk around the tree. And then it goes on to say what the virgins do with the intestines.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the introduction of a theme which was very widespread across Europe, mostly in Christian magical incantations of either the 3 virgins or the 3 sisters. And when I read about this, I was like, yes, this is it. Because, other scholarly works had kind of made vague reference to the possibility, and those that focus on Eastern Europe knew that among Polish Christians, there was a magical incantation that involved 3 sisters. But in fact, this was across Europe, right, for many, many centuries. So keep that in mind as we move forward, okay? Now we have this very, very interesting womb incantation from the 14th century. It's so interesting because apparently it was written on the margins of a manuscript, which, by the way, this is where magical charms were often written, right? They were often written down as like someone unofficial saying, and by the way, this thing works. And then they were passed down in that particular way because very often they were oral. Sometimes they got written down. And this one was in German, but it was written in Hebrew characters. And it's one of the only medieval, if not the only medieval German magical spell that we have that we know was also written down in Hebrew characters, which means that Jews used it.
Wow.
So I've been working really hard on this one. It's very difficult because it's in medieval High German, which I don't read. I read modern German, but not that kind of German. And it's in Hebrew characters, and then there's different translations of it. So it's a complicated text to read. I just gave you a few lines from it that I was sure about and that was relevant to our discussion. So it goes, womb, lie down. This is how it starts. You are as old as me. If you take me down to the earth, you must be buried with me. And by the way, this was a pretty common element of womb incantations, to talk to the womb as if it were a separate creature, as if it lived separately, as if it had its own life.
Wow.
And then today I was reading, I was like, oh, I get it. It's saying if the womb causes me to die, then the womb is going to die too. I didn't get it before that for some reason, but I finally got it. And then it goes, a bottomless sea flows underneath. And this is like so eerie. It's just wild. A bottomless sea flows underneath. In it swims a fish without scales. And the fish, another scholar has proved pretty, I think, pretty well, pretty definitively that that fish is itself referring to the womb, the fish without scales. But the piece that's important for us is the last one. 3 mermaids sat on the sand, and they had a hold of my intestines. The first beat them. The second straightens them out. And the third moves them into the right place. Now that particular pattern, where you have the 3 women, the 3 virgins, or the 3 sisters, or the 3 maidens, in this case the 3 mermaids, right? Because there's the theme of the sea here, very, very important. So the pattern is that the first sister, generally, is the one who is represented as causing the harm. And the second and the third sisters are the ones who begin to undo the harm, right? Because this is usually how magic works. You have a doing, and then you have to have an undoing, right? Magic is often represented, a magical spell is represented as tying a knot, and then you have to untie the knot. So this charm that we're looking at, this larger charm called the 3 women charm, is an undoing charm, right? It's a spell that undoes the evil eye. So what's fascinating is that we know that German Jews in the Middle Ages were using, at least some of them were, they were using this kind of 3 sisters or 3 virgins charm that was, as I mentioned, was very, very widespread among Christians. Another thing that we know about German Jews in the Middle Ages is that they had a ritual around the birth of a baby. Not a bris. I mean, they had a bris, but that's not the one that I'm talking about, which was called Holokreis. Holokreis. I don't have it here on the Sefaria, so I'll put it in the chat just so you can see it. Holokreis. Has anybody heard of Holokreis?
No.
Holokreis was the ritual, the ceremony at which the baby was given its secular name. And that was for boys and for girls. The reason it was called Holokreis was because Hola was a medieval German demoness or goddess. And she was a demon who would kidnap children. Is this starting to sound familiar at all?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so Jews also had a demoness who kidnapped children, and her name was?
Lilith.
Thank you. So Holokreis was called that because when the baby's name was given, or just before that, when it was a time of greatest danger, the children and other people would shout, Hola, 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 to scare Hola away.
It's so good to be with you all, especially in this tense and difficult time. And I'll add to that also very confusing time. And I think the numbers of people that are
someone is unmuted.
Other programs in the space showing us just
how
there we go.
Thank you. Okay, so anyway, Holokreis was because they wanted to scare Hola away, and that was for Christians and Jews. Now, there developed this custom, which is related to Holokreis, and this continued for centuries into the, actually down to our present day. And the custom was that the nights leading up to the bris, and especially the night before the bris, you had a special meal where you invited guests, and then some people would leave a special table with food on it out for the whole night. And that wasn't for the guests. Guess who it was for? It was probably for either Hola or Lilith or other demons who might want to come and steal the baby, and you did that to appease them. So this ties into that theme of the three virgins, who, by the way, as you might already have guessed, are seen in a very ambivalent way. They're in some way they're compared to goddesses in some of these charms, and sometimes they're even called the three Marys, and sometimes they're seen in a more negative light because, as I mentioned earlier, often it's the first one in that pattern who is causing the pain. So there's a really ambivalent relationship with these three women. Okay, Rabbi Rose, about how much more time do I have? It's 5 to 10. I think if you said something, you were muted.
About 15, 20 minutes.
Oh yeah, that's fine. Okay, so let's just quickly look at this this piece from the Shulchan Aruch, from the Code of Jewish Law from the 16th century. And as you may know, this was composed of two parts. The part that was the original, the Sephardic law and custom that was written in Eretz Israel, and then there was the gloss written by Moses Isserlis, by a Polish rabbi who added Polish Jewish customs, Ashkenazic customs, and that's how we get the whole Shulchan Aruch. So could someone please read the English for this text? Chaim, would you read it?
One who eats and leaves crumbs on his table should not place a full loaf on the table. Ramah, Isserlis, in some places it is the custom to set out a table with various delicacies the night before the circumcision. Some forbid this custom because it is like those who set a table for luck, idols. But because it is intended for the good fortune of the child, some authorities permit it.
Okay, thanks. So this tells us the first sentence there, I'm not really sure what that's about. I haven't looked into that yet, and maybe I can talk later on with or some point with Rabbi Rose about it, or someone else who understands it. It may be related to it. But what I'm interested in is what the Polish Rabbi Isserlis, has to say here. Right? He says in some places it is the custom to set out a table with various delicacies the night before the circumcision. And some forbid this custom because, and he quotes here, the proof text was Isaiah 65:11, where it talks about setting a table for God. The word is God in Hebrew, Gimel Dalet, which means something like luck, or we could refer to a particular constellation, something that you shouldn't be worshiping, right? Something that you shouldn't be setting out an offering to. And so there were rabbis, and by the way, in another place in the Shulchan Aruch, very close to here, Rabbi Caro, who was the Sephardic author, said it's always forbidden. But Isserlis says, well, because, he doesn't say I permit it, but he says, because it's kind of intended in a good way for the child, some authorities permit it. And by the way, in the history of halacha, sometimes this kind of decision was reached simply because too many Jews were doing this thing, and you could not actually rule against it. You just couldn't do it because they wouldn't accept it. You knew they wouldn't. So you had to figure out a way to make it possible for people to do it so that they weren't transgressing halacha. And this gives us a sense that this was being done. We already know that it was being done in the Middle Ages. Now we know that it was being done in the 1500s and probably continued for centuries after that. Again, we don't know, we don't have a particular, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say that they're setting it out for someone in particular. It doesn't say they're setting it out for Hola or for Lilith or for the three virgins, but I don't think it would say that anyway, because that would be shaming certain Jews who were doing that custom. So they just say, they kind of refer obliquely to the fact that it might come close to idol worship, or as the Talmud usually puts it, mipnei darkeha emori, in the ways of the Amorites. And that's usually where the Talmud draws a line between permitted magic and non-permitted magic. And the Talmud permitted lots of different kinds of magic, especially if it was for healing purposes, for medical purposes, as magic often was in the middle, in antiquity and in the Middle Ages. So now I'm going to go back to the charm.
Tom,
and
can I ask a quick question?
Yes, who's that?
This is Brad.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Brad.
Okay, thanks. Is this a pattern of any kind where you have the Sephardic Jews wanting to hold to halacha and not stray, and the Ashkenazis are more kind of wandering off on their own and going astray, so to speak?
Well, that's a great
in these matters.
It's a great question. Actually, it was often, I think, and Rabbi Rose, correct me if I'm mistaken here, but I think I'm correct in saying that that Sephardic decisors, legal decisors, were usually more liberal than Ashkenazic ones. And that continues to be the case today. So it's actually surprising that Israelists would have said, but in fact, there's some leniency here and some authorities permit it. But this is why he said that kind of thing. Then, in other cases, this was true if you follow it throughout the Shulchan Aruch. Israelists sheds light for us on how different the customs of Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews were. Minhag, custom, was a huge part of Jewish life in the Middle Ages. It's hard to exaggerate how important a part it was. We don't really know it much anymore because, we're all immigrants in a sense. We all come from different places, and many of us Google things that we should be doing on certain holidays. But that's not how it worked in the Middle Ages. You did something because your parents did it.
Natan, will you just explain minhag?
Yeah, minhag is Jewish custom as opposed to Jewish law, which you could look up in a code of Jewish law, and which existed in many different iterations across the Middle Ages, and you could go back to the Talmud, and in theory, you could find out how to do a certain mitzvah, what was permitted and what was not permitted. But over the centuries, different Jewish communities developed all kinds of different customs that those aspects of life that were not necessarily dictated by Jewish law. In fact, sometimes they were dictated by Jewish law, and people just decided they were doing something different or developed in a different way. And medieval Jews held on to their customs just as strongly, and sometimes even more strongly than they held on to law, to halacha. So that was a really, really important part of it. And that's why Israelis is very often in his gloss, he says, but that's not how we do things here. We have a different custom for that. And then he sometimes brings that particular custom, because if that had not been included as part of the overall discussion of Jewish law in the Shulchan Aruch, then only Sephardic customs would have been transcribed, and not the Ashkenazic customs. And also, just to make it more complicated, within each of those groups, there were also subgroups that had their own customs. Sometimes an individual city or town would have its own way of doing a particular thing that wasn't done that way in another case. Any other questions that have come up for people before I sum up?
Natan,
Yes,
Professor
Rabbi.
Meir, you're kind of blowing my mind. I mean, this is really, we could spend much more time really discussing this, simply because it sounds to me like some of your work is a kind of recovery of a very different Judaism that was lived and known and experienced, and it was feminine. And when I was pregnant with my first son, an older Jewish woman said, well, do you have a charm to ward off the evil eye when it's born? And I looked at her like she was crazy. And she said, well, no, but I grew up with that. You would tie something red on the crib
Right.
or on the stroller or anything. You didn't want anything. So there is something in the oral tradition and also I think the female tradition with what your work or what you're exploring. And thank you so much for your contribution. It's really incredible.
No, thanks for saying that, Faf. I really appreciate that. That means a lot, especially coming from you. And what you're saying now actually reminds me that I should have said earlier when I was giving my whole soapbox speech about how we've lost all the magical elements of Judaism. That's true for most American Jews, I would say today. But if you go to Israel, and among especially Jews who come from Arab lands, Mizrahi Jews, very often in those families, and yes, especially among women, that magical element is still very much there. You can watch Israeli movies that try to capture that element of the kind of the feminine magic, if you like. There's a very strong sense. We just saw it actually in that tragic incident that happened a few weeks ago on Lag BaOmer, when at the Hilula, at the Lag BaOmer celebration at Mount Meron in northern Israel, when 45 people were killed. But that a lot of what's going on there has its roots not only in Kabbalah but also in what scholars would call magic, because there's a lot of amulets and there's a lot of touching certain things, touching the grave of a certain saint. In Israel, if you've watched, oh no, that's something else. I was thinking of some other TV show, but there are holy saints' graves that you can make pilgrimages to in Israel, and people do that, especially when they have particular challenges in life that they want assistance with. So that kind of magic actually, on some level, is still alive. And I actually found this charm, the three women's charm. I found it the day before yesterday, on an Israeli website for segulot, for charms. And so it's in a slightly different version, but it's essentially the same thing. Rabbi?
So I want to ask you kind of a meta question. So maybe you don't want to answer it until you've kind of wrapped this up. So feel free to blow it off. But I'm curious as to, I want to hear a little bit, if you would address what is your interest in this? How are these texts compelling to you? And I'm wondering if it is as sort of a little bit in line with what Faf was saying, like recovering this lost part of our people. Or does it resonate on a deeper, on a spiritual level with you? Or I'm just wondering, because, these texts are so alien in some ways to our ordinary sensibility, to our modern sensibility. And I'm just wondering what they mean to you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. Actually, that helps me segue to the larger conclusion anyway. The truth is, I'm still figuring this out. I don't know for sure. I thought when I dipped my toe into this field of Jewish magic that it was going to be something that I really wanted to swim in. And now I don't know. I mean, I've done a lap, and I think that might be enough for me. It was this particular incantation that really interested me, precisely because of that line about the three women standing on a crag. Because I was like, this has got to have some bigger meaning. Where does this come from? And it's these long connections in Jewish history, what we call both the synchronic and diachronic connections. Those are the fancy terms that historians use for connections over time, over many centuries, but also the connections horizontally between Jews and their neighbors, like these, the Christian charms that I was talking about. That really fascinates me, because it does uncover a part of Jewish history that most people don't know about. What I was really hoping for, to be honest with you, is I was hoping to find some modern Yiddish and Hebrew writers who would have known about that charm and incorporated it into their own writings, because mostly what I tend to gravitate towards these days is figuring out how modern Jewish culture incorporates these ancient Jewish symbols and tropes and then gives them new life. And I was shocked. Maybe I haven't seen it yet, but I haven't uncovered any that charm resurfacing anywhere than in the traditional literature where you would expect it. So that's kind of the direction that I'm heading in, is really it's less about the magic itself and more about how is this magic understood and reinterpreted and then kind of used as a tool in shaping Jewish identity in the modern age, if that makes sense.
Sure.
I have a question. This is Lydia.
Yes, Lydia.
If I may. So I grew up in a household with two Lithuanian bobbers who never ever really learned to speak English and so on. And they had sayings which I remember so clearly. So for example, if they wanted to sew a button on a shirt which had just come on, they said, you have to take the shirt off because if we sew on a person, we're going to sew up their brains. So there were those sorts of things. And I'm wondering if those sorts of sayings relate to some of this magical, mystical times that you're talking about, or where those sorts of customs or thoughts might have come from.
Yes, that's a great question, and that I think they definitely did. Many of those kinds of those sayings, which unfortunately sometimes we call them old wives' tales or things like that, but actually those embody or they're fragments of a much larger body of magical wisdom that people had access to often, as you say, often through their bobbas. And
well, every second, if you said something, they say, okay, Nahora. Don't
well,
cast
yes. Kehora means, right, no, may there be no evil eye. And that was a very important thing to say. The evil eye, by the way, I mean, there's a whole body of literature that I discovered about the evil eye, which was considered very, very dangerous. And that's why people would, they would spit. The spit was considered a very efficacious remedy against the evil eye. So in fact, one of the charms of three women in Yiddish begins with, and it's literally written out, tfu, tfu, tfu. You have to spit as you're starting that. And then at the end of it, you have to yawn. But I'm not going to get into the yawning right now. Miles, you had a question.
Yeah, so I can think of two great recoveries in sort of Misnagid Yehudut. Like, there was the recovery of Chassidut, maybe through Martin Buber, and there was the recovery of Kabbalah through Gershon Sholem.
Right.
So this is like I'm wondering, and this is sort of a variant of the question you've already been asked, is there a body of something here that could be recovered in a form that could be used by rationalist modern Jews? Or is this something completely different from those two earlier cases, which had a rich intellectual architectures of their own that could be intellectualized into the present? And this kind of stuff, you can't really do that. It's just not capable of doing what we did with those.
Right. So Miles is asking if there's a way that we can kind of create almost a renaissance of Jewish magical knowledge, as we've seen renaissance of Jewish mystical knowledge in the past, and that kind of thing. For me, the way it would work is only through art, because I can't really see bringing this kind of magic into shul, for example. It's weird, it's wacky, but we just don't really relate to it as moderns. But on the level of art and culture, I think it is possible to relate to it, because when we enter into a book or when we enter into a theater or a movie theater, you allow your mind to work in different ways, and I think you're more open. So, I could imagine, for example, I'm not an artist, but I can imagine working with a choreographer or an artist to capture some of these images, because they're so wild, right? This image of the bottomless sea and the three women on a mountain, it's like, how are you going to talk about that in a rational way? But I think it has such power that there is some way. And that's why I was so surprised that I didn't see it in literature. I was like, but this is great stuff. It's so rich. Why is it not there? And again, I think maybe it's just that I haven't looked in the right places, but I think art is really the key.
Natan, so I'm Harvey Frankel.
Well, Harvey, hold on one second. Sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to ask the Rabbi how much. I think we're out of time.
Well, Chaim had his hand up. I'm just trying to honor the line of questions here.
Oh, yes. Okay. And this might have to be the last one, given where we are in terms of time. But yes, Chaim.
I was just going to ask if you've kind of uncovered the line between some of the more like Kabbalistic, magical kind of stuff that you get with a person like the Baal Shem Tov, who's characterized in some of the stories that people were really interested in telling about his life, that they sound very magical, and he sounds like kind of a magical character, and that was part of it, his early life. So have you found kind of the safe harbor between like normal Kabbalah magic and like this kind of magic that we're talking about here, or is that kind of something people would?
He was an amulet maker.
Yeah, there really is no difference actually, because for us, we tend to see Hasidism as, or it's marketed to us, it's sold to us as I think really almost entirely based in scholarship and in normative Jewish wisdom, right? Normative Jewish learning. And that was only part of Hasidism's appeal. Hasidism was very magical, and especially in its early days, and even later on, many of the rebbes were wonder workers. That's how they were seen, and Christians came to them as well as Jews because their magic was seen as just as efficacious as that of Baalei Shem, who were the kind of the Jewish shamans of Eastern Europe at the time. So yeah, I mean, I think it could be that if you go into certain Hasidic communities today, you'll find maybe just, wouldn't say just as much. There's certainly be elements of magic there, but I think a lot of that has been subsumed by the much more cerebral Judaism, whereas it wasn't like that to begin with.
Last question to Harvey.
Okay, I think that a lot of this magic formula gets corrupted and filtered down through the shtetl life to become superstition. For instance, what Lydia was saying, what my mother did when she, for instance, was shortening my pants or lengthening my pants, she would sew a thread, but in order not to sew up my brains, she would tear off a piece of thread and make me chew it so that she would sew up my brain. I mean, and the most damaging thing is that mothers should not brag about their children or talk about their children because it would attract the kinahara.
Right.
That was so. My mother never ever said anything good about me because the evil eye was watching. So it turned into something ridiculous and destructive, and that's the way it filtered down through the shtetl.
No. Yeah. I mean, I think you have a point there, Harvey. I don't think that, I'm not saying this is, I don't mean to say, by the way, that this is like, there's this whole positive body of knowledge in Judaism that we're missing, that we need to, we need to resurrect. It's like anything within Judaism, it's complicated, right? And as you say, also when people lost that larger understanding of Jewish magic, and it became just fragmentary, as often happened with immigrants to the United States, then you would just get what we call superstition, which is like you say something, but you don't know why you're saying it. You just say it because your grandmother said it, or because you understood that it was an important thing to say at a particular moment. And then, of course, there's the piece about parents not saying anything nice about their children, so they wouldn't tempt the evil eye, which is obviously not a very nice way to grow up.
Well, I want to ask, I want to throw out one other little thing, and then Natan, I'll just give you the last word to wrap up this totally fascinating and evocative teaching. And that is, it sounds like you might be done with this. As you said, you feel like you've maybe done a lap, but I wonder if in, it's kind of going to sound like it's coming out of nowhere, but in dream analysis, instead of like Jungian stuff about collective unconscious, I wonder whether there are some recorded things that might resonate with some of this stuff, because like the intestines hanging from the tree and the animal underneath the sea, it's just very resonant of some dream imagery. And I just wonder whether there's some record of that stuff being discussed in some of those circles of Freud, pre-Freud, Jungian, and other stuff.
I hadn't thought about that, but what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me, and it could be a good line of a good research angle, a good line of inquiry, because it does that those images are just they're so kind of collective unconscious, you know?
Yeah, right. Kind of very uncanny.
Yeah, uncanny is definitely the word. Yeah. So, you know, just to sum up, I don't really have any, you know, major reveal here. It's just that I found this to be really interesting, and I wanted to share it with you all, share with you some of my findings about it, both the kind of the Jewish background, you know, the Jewish textual background behind those biblical verses, and also the very complicated pagan, Christian, Jewish magic behind the image of the three women, which I finally managed to figure out, which was very, very satisfying on a personal level.
Very
So
interesting.
thanks everyone for being here and for your
Thank you.
questions.
Thank you, everyone.
Totally
You.
fascinating.
Chag Sameach.
Totally
Chag
fascinating.
Sameach.
Thank you so much,
Thank
Natan.
you.
I want to say,
Yasher
I want to say, Natan, to you, thank you. And also, you know, kind of an implicit message of Natan's teaching here is, you know, on Shavuot, we tend to construct Torah, well, not just on Shavuot, we tend to construct the idea of Torah in a kind of more narrow way. That is, things that come to us from texts that claim to be holy and authoritative.
Coming in
But
two.
when we take in our own history, even our folk history of our people, and understand that there's much to be learned from it, and it gives us a self-understanding, we understand that Torah is actually a much broader idea. So, Chaim, for your amazing research and your wonderful thoughts, and Natan for your deep research and your reflections upon Jewish folk culture. I'm so grateful to both of you, to all of you, for being here and for making tonight very special. I thank you. And I also want to say two things. One is I'm once again putting into the chat information about how to connect to the Rabbinical Assembly ongoing learning. I just put into the chat. I have the link to the live YouTube feed you can go to. And I want to say, somebody asked me whether this is being recorded. It is being recorded. I honestly have no idea how to tell you how to access that recording, but if you contact the office after Shavuot, I'm sure that we'll post the recording on our website or something like that. And I want to wish everybody a Chag Sameach, a good Yontif. Tomorrow morning at 9:30, we'll have our first morning Shavuot davening, and then the same thing Tuesday morning, same time, and which will also include Yizkor. So again, thank you to our teachers and everybody else. Good Yontif. Thank you for being here.
Chag Sameach, everyone.
Chag Sameach.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.